In the sands of ancient Egypt, where the Nile River carved life into a harsh and unforgiving landscape, there existed a ruler unlike any other. His name was Akhenaten, a pharaoh whose reign is both fascinating and bewildering in equal measure. Akhenaten is remembered by history not for the conventional power of a ruler, vast conquests, or extravagant monuments, but for something much more profound and ultimately disastrous: his attempt to change Egypt's entire religious system. For over 1,000 years, the ancient Egyptians had worshipped a pantheon of gods, each governing a different aspect of life. From the sun god Ra to Osiris, god of the afterlife, these gods had been as much a part of daily life as the very Nile itself. But during the 14th century BCE, a young pharaoh named Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne, later taking the name Akhenaten. He would soon embark on an unprecedented journey that would reshape the very soul of his civilization. The first indication of his break from tradition came early in his reign. Akhenaten, at the time still known as Amenhotep IV, began to openly embrace a singular deity, the aten, the disk of the sun. Whereas the Egyptians had always acknowledged the sun as an important symbol, the aten was to be not just a symbol, but the one and only god of Egypt. This wasn't merely a shift in religious preference, spiritual and social order. The pharaoh's decision to elevate the aten above all other gods would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change Egypt's religious and cultural landscape. He ordered that all references to the traditional gods be erased, their temples abandoned, and their priests silenced. Akhenaten's vision was to be a monotheistic Egypt, a nation with one god, one true ruler, and one unifying belief. For a civilization built on polytheism, this was a revolutionary, even heretical, shift. But what prompted such a radical change? Akhenaten's motivations remain one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history. Was he truly a visionary who saw the aten as the one god who could unite his people? Or was he a ruler whose ego and desire for control pushed him to make decisions that would ultimately destabilize his kingdom? Historians have debated this question for centuries, and the answer is elusive. There were several factors that may have contributed to Akhenaten's decision. Some scholars suggest that his mother, Queen Tai, who had strong influence in the court, may have exposed him to the idea of a singular god. Others speculate that Akhenaten may have simply believed that the aten represented the most powerful force in the world. After all, the sun provided life and order to the land. The aten, in Akhenaten's eyes, was not a distant god living in a temple, but the very light and energy that made life possible. While his motivations may never be fully understood, one thing is certain: Akhenaten's decision to prioritize the aten over all other deities led to the creation of a new capital city, Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, in the middle of the desert. This city was not just an architectural feat, but a symbolic declaration of Akhenaten's religious revolution. The city was built to honor the aten, with open-air temples and vast, spacious layouts, meant to bring its worshippers closer to the sun god. But what were the effects of Akhenaten's new religious vision on the people of Egypt? How did this radical departure from the past impact the country's politics, society, and economy? Were the Egyptians ready to embrace a single all-encompassing god, or did this change sow seeds of rebellion and unrest? In the next section, We'll delve into the immediate aftermath of Akhenaten's decision and explore how his people responded to the dawn of a new religious era. As Akhenaten's new city of Akhenaten rose from the barren desert sands, so too did tensions quietly simmer beneath the surface of Egyptian society. The grand vision of a monotheistic Egypt, centered solely around the aten, was ambitious but also fragile. It challenged centuries of tradition, deeply rooted religious customs, and the very foundations of the powerful priesthoods that had long supported the pharaoh's predecessors. Akhenaten's religious revolution was more than a spiritual shift. It was a political upheaval. The priests of Amen, the powerful god whose temple at Karnak had been the wealthiest and most influential institution in Egypt, suddenly found themselves marginalized. Their income, status, and influence waned rapidly as the pharaoh ordered temples closed and the worship of Amen and other gods suppressed. This wasn't merely a religious reform. It was a direct attack on a formidable social order. The Egyptian populace, too, faced an abrupt change in their daily lives. Religion permeated everything from agriculture cycles, where festivals celebrated the fertility gods, to personal prayers and household shrines dedicated to a multitude of deities. Now, these traditions were outlawed or abandoned in favor of rituals directed exclusively to the aten. For many ordinary Egyptians, the shift was confusing, disruptive, and often unwelcome. Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, became the central figures in this new worship. Art and culture were transformed to reflect the intimacy between the royal family and the aten, rather than the stoic, idealized figures common in Egyptian art. Depictions showed Akhenaten and Nefertiti in tender, almost mundane moments, with their children reaching towards the rays of the aten, which ended in little hands, symbolizing the god's life-giving touch. This new style, known as the Amarna art style, was unique and startling to the Egyptian eye. Yet, it also reinforced the singularity of the aten worship. Only the royal family was shown in direct communion with the god. Priests and common people, once intermediaries between gods and man, found themselves sidelined. This elevated the pharaoh's status in an unprecedented way, but alienated many. Economically, the impact was noticeable, but often overlooked. The closure of temples meant the cessation of large-scale, temple-funded projects, and the disruption of the temple economy that employed countless artisans, laborers, and priests. The funds once flowing into numerous cult centers were now funneled exclusively to Akhenaten, creating a new economic center, but also destabilizing older urban centers dependent on traditional religious institutions. Politically, religious reforms made Egypt vulnerable. His focus on religious transformation and the building of a new capital distracted him from external threats. Egypt's neighbors, particularly in Canaan and Syria, began to chafe under Egyptian influence. Records from the time show increased unrest and rebellion in these territories, problems that Akhenaten appears either unwilling or unable to address effectively. Meanwhile, Akhenaten's spiritual revolution met resistance at home. Many Egyptians, especially the priestly class and traditionalists, harbored resentment toward the new order. They had lost privilege and influence, and the familiar gods they had worshipped for generations were effectively erased from official practice. While open rebellion is not well documented, it's reasonable to suspect that silent opposition and passive resistance were common. What also remains a mystery is how Akhenaten himself dealt with this opposition. Did he genuinely believe in the aten supremacy above all else, or was he aware that his reign was precarious? Some scholars suggest that in the later years of his reign, Akhenaten's health declined, and with it, the zeal of his religious fervor may have waned. Letters and records from the period hint at diplomatic concerns and internal unrest creeping back into focus, yet the aten remained the official and sole god. Toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, signs appeared that the revolutionary tide was turning. The old gods and temples began to regain their lost prominence quietly. The king's successors would soon abandon the aten worship altogether, restoring the traditional religious framework. But for now, Akhenaten stood as the physical and spiritual center of an almost utopian vision. In Egypt, united under one god, led by a pharaoh who saw himself as the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine. But what exactly led to the unraveling of this unique experiment? How did Akhenaten's religious revolution come to an end? And what became of Akhenaten and its people once the pharaoh passed? These questions lead us to the final chapter of this story, one marked by political restoration, the erasure of Akhenaten's legacy, and the long shadow cast over Egyptian history by his bold but ultimately failed attempt at monotheism. Akhenaten's reign, marked by his monotheistic revolution and the rise of Akhenaten, came to an end after approximately 17 years. His death around 1336 BCE brought not only the conclusion of a singular reign, but also the gradual dismantling of a religious experiment that had sent ripples through Egyptian society. Almost immediately after his passing, the wheels of restoration began to turn. His successor, likely his son Tutankhaten, better known to history as Tutankhamun, took the throne as a child. Within a few years, Tutankhamun's name itself was changed from servant of the aten to servant of Amen, symbolizing a deliberate return to the traditional gods. The capital moved away from the desert city of Akhenaten back toward Thebes, the religious heartland of Egypt. The monuments and inscriptions glorifying the aten were systematically defaced or erased. Temples to the old gods, especially Amen, were reopened, priests reinstated, and rituals resumed. Akhenaten's name was struck from official records in what would become an early form of damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory. This erasure was not just political. It was an attempt to wipe from history the idea that one god should reign alone in Egypt, despite the fervor to erase Akhenaten's legacy. The consequences of his reign lingered beneath the surface, his radical ideas, whether embraced or rejected, exposed vulnerabilities in Egyptian society, particularly the intertwining of religious authority and political power. The rebellion of the priesthood highlighted how central these institutions were to Egypt's stability. One could argue that Akhenaten's story is less about failure and more about an extraordinary moment when one man dared to challenge millennia of tradition. His vision, though short-lived, was revolutionary, not just in religious terms, but in its assertion of royal authority as the direct conduit to a singular divine power. Yet the practical implications of this revolution were messy. The economy suffered as temple-based wealth was redistributed. Foreign relations faltered as political focus waned. and social unrest brewed as ordinary Egyptians struggled to adapt to the new religious demands. Akhenaten's reforms, while intellectually fascinating, did not provide a sustainable framework for governance or society. The city of Akhenaten itself was abandoned within a generation. Archaeological ruins reveal a city frozen in time, a stark testament to a fleeting dream. Its temples, homes, and administrative buildings lay deserted, quickly reclaimed by the desert sands. The people who had once lived there scattered, returning to more established centers. In a broader historical context, Akhenaten's attempt at monotheism can be seen as one of the earliest recorded instances of religious radicalism, precursor to later monotheistic faiths. Though distinct in its cultural and theological context, his story invites reflection on how religious ideas can shape, disrupt, and define civilizations, but also on the human costs when such ideas clash with entrenched institutions and traditions. As you lie here listening, consider the quiet resilience of those who lived through Akhenaten's reign. The priests stripped of their power, the workers uprooted to build a new city in the desert, the farmers and common folk asked to worship a god unseen in temples of old. What was it like to live through this religious revolution, to witness the dismantling of everything familiar? And ultimately, what does Akhenaten's story tell us about the nature of change? How even the grandest visions may be swallowed by the tides of history, leaving only whispers behind. If a pharaoh could attempt to rewrite the divine order, what does that say about the fragile balance between tradition and innovation, belief and power? In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, some of the earliest cities in human history began to take shape. Here, around 4000 BCE, the Sumerians built the world's first urban centers complex, bustling hubs of trade, politics, and religion. At the heart of these cities rose one of the most enduring architectural symbols of ancient Mesopotamia, the ziggurat. Unlike the soaring temples and cathedrals of later civilizations, the ziggurat was a massive, stepped platform, man-made mountain reaching toward the heavens. But these structures were not simply grand monuments. They were the physical embodiment of a deeply held belief that the gods inhabited the skies and that humans could connect with them through ritual and worship in elevated places. The origins of the ziggurat can be traced back to humble beginnings. Early Sumerian temples started as modest shrines, simple mud brick structures dedicated to local deities. Over time, as city-states like your Uruk and Eridu grew in size and importance, so did the scale and complexity of their religious buildings. The ziggurat evolved from these earlier temples, rising higher with each generation. Constructed primarily from mud brick, a readily available but fragile material, the ziggurats were designed with a broad base that tapered upward in a series of terraces or steps. The shape symbolized a sacred mountain, a bridge between earth and the divine. The top platform housed the shrine or temple where the city's patron god was believed to dwell. The construction of a ziggurat was no small feat. It required extensive labor, resources, and organization reflecting not just religious devotion, but political power. The rulers and priesthoods coordinated massive workforces, mobilizing farmers, artisans, and laborers, especially during the flood seasons when agricultural work slowed. Every brick in a ziggurat was a testament to human ingenuity and societal order. Builders crafted the bricks from mud and straw, sun-dried or kill-fired for durability. The massive platforms were reinforced by buttresses, drainage systems, and protective outer walls to withstand Mesopotamia's harsh weather. The largest and most famous of these structures was the great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god, Nana. Standing over 100 feet tall in its prime, it was the spiritual and administrative heart of the city. Its sheer scale inspired awe not only in its builders but in travelers and traders who passed through the bustling city. But what did these imposing structures mean for the everyday lives of Sumerians? For the priests who maintained the temples, the ziggurat was a sacred place of ritual, a point of contact with the gods. For ordinary citizens, the towering ziggurat was a daily reminder of divine authority and the power of the city's rulers. The construction of ziggurats also highlights the social stratification of Sumerian society. While priests and nobles lived in relative comfort, many of the laborers who built the temples were farmers or lower-class workers compelled to participate in state projects. This system of corvée labor tied the population to the needs of the state and its gods. Yet, despite their grandeur and spiritual significance, ziggurats were also fragile both physically and politically. Built on mud brick in flood-prone regions, they required constant maintenance. More importantly, they stood at the center of a civilization that would face external threats and internal upheaval. How did these religious monuments endure the passage of centuries? Did they continue to inspire loyalty and reverence in times of peace and crisis? And what eventually led to the decline and abandonment of the great ziggurats of Sumer? These questions invite us to explore not just the architecture, but the human stories behind these ancient monuments, revealing the complex interplay between faith, power, and survival. In one of the world's earliest civilizations, the ziggurat was much more than a towering monument. It was the pulsating heart of Sumerian city life. Around its vast base sprawled the temple complex and administrative buildings, weaving together religion, governance, and economy into a tightly knit system that shaped every aspect of daily existence. The priests, often regarded as the earthly representatives of the gods, held immense power. They were responsible not only for the rituals performed at the summit shrine, but also for maintaining the delicate balance between the human and divine realms. Their duties ranged from interpreting omens and conducting sacrifices to managing temple estates and redistributing resources. Daily life for these priests was regimented and austere. They lived in quarters adjacent to the temple complex, adhering to strict purity laws and schedules of worship. Many specialized in roles such as scribes, musicians, or ritual specialists. Some priests were educated in cuneiform writing, enabling them to keep detailed records of offerings, grain storage, and temple finances. Yet the religious elite's power came with heavy responsibilities. Maintaining the temple's wealth and land holdings was crucial to sustaining the city-state's economy. The temple owned large tracts of farmland, workshops, and even controlled trade caravans. Through this, the ziggurat was not only a spiritual center, but also a hub of economic control. Outside the priestly class, ordinary Sumerians, farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers interacted with the ziggurat complex primarily during festivals and market days. These occasions brought the community together to celebrate religious events, pay homage to the gods, and engage in commerce. The festivals were elaborate affairs, blending religious ritual with social and economic functions. One notable example was the New Year festival, during which the king and priests renewed their vows to the gods, and the community participated in symbolic rituals meant to secure fertility and prosperity. Music, feasting, and public ceremonies enlivened the streets around the ziggurat. The ziggurat's influence extended beyond religion and economy. It was also a political symbol. Kings often portrayed themselves as chosen by the gods, responsible for the construction or restoration of the ziggurat. This served to legitimize their rule and assert divine favor. The construction and maintenance of the ziggurat required vast labor forces, often conscripted during periods when agricultural work was minimal, such as during floods. This system of corvée labor reflected a societal contract where citizens contributed to communal projects in exchange for protection and resources. However, this labor was not without its challenges. Archaeological evidence points to periods of unrest, as heavy demands on the populace sometimes bred discontent. Maintaining the enormous temple complexes required constant effort, both physical and administrative. Externally, Sumerian city-states, each with their own ziggurats and patron deities, often competed for resources and influence. Warfare was frequent, and the ziggurat often served as a refuge or symbol of defiance during sieges. Yet, despite their defensive role, these massive structures were vulnerable to destruction by invading armies or natural disasters. The fragility of the ziggurats mirrored the precariousness of the civilization itself. Over centuries, the Sumerians faced invasions from neighboring peoples, including the Akkadians and later the Babylonians. With each conquest, the political and religious landscape shifted, and the role of the ziggurat transformed. Eventually, the once-proud ziggurats were abandoned as cities fell into ruin or were overshadowed by new powers and religious ideas. The mud brick that made up these monumental structures eroded, leaving only the foundations beneath the desert sands. What, then, was the lasting legacy of the ziggurat and the civilization that built it? How did these stepped temples influence subsequent cultures and their religious architecture? And what lessons can we draw about the intersection of faith, labor, and political power from the rise and fall of these ancient monuments? In the next section, we will explore the final decline of the Sumerian ziggurats and reflect on their enduring echoes in human history. The grand ziggurats that once dominated the cityscapes of Sumer were not destined to endure forever. Over time, a combination of environmental, political, and social factors led to their gradual decline, leaving behind only the ruins and memories of a civilization that had once thrived between the rivers. One of the most persistent challenges facing the Sumerian city-states was the environment itself. The Mesopotamian plains were fertile but fickle, dependent on the regular flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Over centuries, irrigation systems silted up or collapsed, and salinization of the soil reduced agricultural yields. Crop failures and food shortages became more frequent, undermining the stability of urban centers. As the economic base weakened, so too did the ability to sustain monumental building projects like ziggurat. Maintenance required constant effort. Without it, mud brick structures began to erode quickly in the harsh climate. The once majestic stepped platforms crumbled, their grandeur fading with each passing generation. Political fragmentation further hastened this decline. The early city-states, while independent and often at odds, shared cultural and religious traditions centered around their ziggurats and patron gods. However, the rise of powerful empires, such as the Akkadian Empire under Sargon and later the Babylonian and Assyrian kingdoms, shifted the balance of power. Conquerors often appropriated the religious symbols and temples of the cities they ruled, integrating local gods into their own pantheons. In some cases, the ziggurats were rebuilt or expanded under new rulers, adapting to changing religious landscapes. But more often, the older Sumerian religious institutions were sidelined or abandoned in favor of new deities and cults. The last flickers of Sumerian culture and its monumental architecture were swallowed by the tides of history. Obscured beneath layers of sand and time, the physical remnants of the ziggurats today stand as silent witnesses to a vanished world. Yet their legacy did not disappear entirely. The concept of the sacred mountain, a bridge between earth and heaven, persisted in Mesopotamian culture and beyond. Later, civilizations built upon the ziggurats, architectural and religious symbolism, influencing temple designs across the ancient Near East. In a broader sense, the ziggurats symbolize the complex relationship between human ambition and the environment, between faith and power. They remind us that civilizations are fragile, dependent on the balance of nature, social cohesion, and political will. For the people who built and worshipped at these structures, the ziggurat was a daily reminder of their place in the cosmos and their connection to the divine. It was a beacon of community, identity, and spiritual aspiration. As you imagine the sun setting over the ruins of Ur or Uruk, casting long shadows over crumbling bricks, consider the lives of those who once climbed those steep terraces, priests carrying out sacred rites, laborers hauling bricks under the desert sun, families gathering for festivals in the temple courtyard. What hopes, fears, and prayers echoed through those ancient stones, and what lessons might those echoes carry for us today about the enduring human quest for meaning and permanence in an ever-changing world. Imagine standing on the dusty outskirts of a Roman camp more than 2,000 years ago, the sun beating down as young men gather, each hoping to transform their lives by joining the famed Roman legions, becoming a legionary soldier in ancient Rome. Was far from glamorous. It was a grueling process that demanded physical endurance, discipline, and mental resilience. The Roman legionary was the backbone of Rome's military might, a citizen soldier responsible not only for defending the empire's borders, but also for building roads, fortifications, and infrastructure. Recruitment drew from Roman citizens, usually males aged between 17 and 46, who met certain physical and moral standards. The army was strict, requiring good health, no physical deformities, and often the ability to read and write, as orders had to be understood and communicated clearly. Once recruited, a new legionary underwent intense training designed to toughen the body and sharpen the mind. Training camps, or castra, were sprawling compounds filled with barracks, training grounds, workshops, and supply depots. The soldiers' day began before dawn and followed a rigid schedule: marches, drills, weapons, practice, and construction duties. Marching was a critical skill. Legionaries were expected to cover impressive distances, up to 20 miles a day, carrying heavy packs. that could weigh 60 pounds or more. This march discipline was essential for rapid deployment across the vast Roman territories, allowing armies to respond swiftly to threats. Weapons training was exhaustive. Soldiers mastered the use of the gladius, a short stabbing sword, the pilum, a throwing spear, and the scutum, a large rectangular shield. Drills emphasized formation fighting, especially the famous testudo or tortoise formation, where shields locked overhead and on the sides to create a nearly impenetrable shell. Discipline was harsh but effective. Punishments for mistakes or disobedience ranged from extra drills and fines to flogging or even execution in extreme cases. This strict regimen created cohesion and ensured that legionaries could operate as a seamless unit in battle. Life wasn't just about fighting. Legionaries learned to build. Camps were fortified with trenches and walls, roads paved, bridges constructed, engineering feats that helped Rome expand and maintain control. This constant labor meant that soldiers were as much builders as warriors. Off-duty had communal meals, often simple fare like porridge, bread, and salted meat. They shared tents and built camaraderie, forging bonds that were vital during long campaigns far from home. The legionaries' pay was modest but steady, supplemented by the spoils of war and the promise of land grants upon retirement. For many, military service was a pathway out of poverty and a chance for social advancement. Yet, beneath this disciplined exterior was a harsh reality. Life on campaign was fraught with danger, not only from enemy armies, but from disease, exhaustion, and the brutal conditions of constant marching and fighting. Many did not survive their full term of service. By the end of their training, these men were transformed from ordinary citizens into disciplined soldiers, ready to face the trials of war and the demands of empire. But how did they fare once thrown into the chaos of battle? How did the life they trained for compare to the brutal reality on the frontier? These questions set the stage for understanding the true experience of a Roman legionary, not just the glory and conquest, but the daily grind, the endurance, and the sheer human effort that underpinned Rome's military success with training. Behind them, the legionaries of Rome were thrust into the vast expanse of the empire's borders, where they faced a world far less controlled than their disciplined camps. The transition from training grounds to active campaigns was stark here. The rigors of war tested every ounce of endurance and resolve. Campaigns could last months or even years, during which soldiers marched over difficult terrain, enduring heat, cold, rain, and hunger. The daily march was relentless, often covering 15 to 20 miles with full equipment, weapons, armor, food supplies, and tools for building and digging. This constant movement demanded stamina and mental toughness, for every step forward could lead to battle or ambush when armies clashed. Legionaries relied heavily on their training and the discipline that kept the unit functioning as a single entity. The Roman battle formation was a marvel of coordination. Lines of soldiers locked their shields, moved as one, and struck in unison. The short gladius was wielded in close quarters, a stabbing weapon meant to exploit openings created by the shield. While, however, the reality of battle was often chaotic and terrifying. Amid the clash of swords, the cries of the wounded, and the dust and confusion, maintaining formation was a challenge. Leadership from centurions' experienced officers was crucial. They moved through the ranks, shouting orders, rallying wavering soldiers, and enforcing discipline. Beyond the front lines, soldiers faced logistical hardships. Supplying a marching army was an immense task. Food and water were often scarce, especially in hostile territory. Legionaries sometimes foraged or raided local settlements, which could alienate local populations and spark uprisings. Disease was a persistent enemy. Camps, often crowded and unsanitary, bred infections like dysentery, respiratory illnesses, and parasites. Medical knowledge was limited, and many soldiers died not from wounds but from illness. The grim reality was that surviving the conditions of campaign was as much a test of luck as skill. When not on the march or in battle, legionaries performed essential duties, constructing fortifications, building roads to improve supply lines, and establishing camps at night, complete with defensive ditches and walls. These engineering works helped secure Roman control and showcased the army's versatility. Despite hardships, the army was also a place of camaraderie and ritual. Soldiers celebrated religious festivals and honored patron gods. Banquets, music, and storytelling provided respite from the hardships of military life. The promise of pay, plunder, and land kept many motivated. Veterans who completed their service often received plots of land in conquered territories, helping Rome to consolidate its expansion and creating a vested interest in the empire's continued growth. Still, the life of a legionary was perilous. Wounds could be fatal without proper care. The mental toll of constant danger was heavy. Desertion was harshly punished, sometimes by execution, but the fear of death or disgrace often kept soldiers in line. How did legionaries reconcile their loyalty to Rome with the brutal realities they faced daily? What stories of survival, resilience, and hardship are hidden behind the disciplined formations and marching drills? As we move to the next section, we will explore the personal lives of these soldiers, their relationships, hopes, and the toll that years of service took on their minds and bodies, shedding light on the human side of Rome's military machine. The Roman legionary was more than a soldier. He was a man caught between the demands of the empire and the rhythms of ordinary life. Though bound by duty, these men sought moments of normalcy, friendship, family, and fleeting peace amid the relentless grind of military service. Camp life offered a semblance of community. Soldiers shared tents, meals, and stories, forming bonds that could rival family ties. This brotherhood was essential for morale, fostering trust in the chaos of battle. They celebrated festivals honoring gods like Mars, the god of war, and Jupiter, the king of gods, seeking divine favor for protection and victory. Many legionaries married local women during their deployments, forging ties with the diverse peoples of the empire. These relationships brought complexities, cultural exchanges, loyalties split between Rome and home, and sometimes children who grew up straddling two worlds. Though official marriage for soldiers was restricted during active service, informal unions were common and tolerated. Letters home, though rare and fragile, were treasured links to the world left behind. Through them, soldiers expressed longing, shared news, and sought comfort. For those who survived the rigors of service, retirement meant more than a pension. It was a chance to settle, often on land granted by the state in frontier provinces, becoming settlers and guardians of Rome's borders. Yet, years of marching, fighting, and labor left many with chronic injuries, damaged joints, scars, and wounds that never fully healed. The mental strain was less visible but equally profound. Exposure to violence, loss, and hardship left psychological scars, a burden often unspoken. Discipline and order that defined their military lives could clash with personal identity and emotions. Legionaries were expected to suppress fear and doubt, embodying Rome's strength. But in quiet moments, many wrestled with loneliness, homesickness, and the weight of their sacrifices. The story of the Roman legionary is thus a story of resilience, testament to human endurance under conditions that would break many. These men were not just instruments of empire. They were individuals navigating a harsh world, seeking meaning and survival. As we reflect on their lives, consider how the legacy of the Roman legionary extends beyond battles won or lost. Their discipline, engineering feats, and the roads they built helped shape the foundation of Western civilization. But it is the human story, the daily struggles, bonds, and endurance that offers the most profound insight into the nature of empire and the costs it exacted. What echoes of the legionaries' experience resonate in the lives of soldiers today? How does their story inform our understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the complex humanity behind military history? When you imagine the Middle Ages, your mind might drift to knights, castles, or kings. But behind the scenes of medieval society, there existed a vast network of artisans and craftsmen whose daily labor built the very foundation of urban life. These were the members of the medieval guilds, organized groups that regulated trades, preserved skills, and shaped communities. Guilds emerged around the 11th and 12th centuries as Europe's towns grew and commerce expanded. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence became bustling centers where goods from near and far were crafted and sold. Yet the quality and reliability of these goods depended on the mastery of individual craftsmen. A guild was much more than a trade union. It was a social institution that controlled who could practice a craft, maintained quality standards, and provided support for members. From blacksmiths and weavers to masons and bakers, guilds governed the rules of production and sale. To become a member, an aspiring craftsman had to progress through stages: apprentice, journeyman, and finally master. Apprentices, often young boys, were bound to a master for several years, learning the trade through hard labor and careful observation. They lived with their master's family, performing menial tasks alongside learning skills. Journeymen completed apprenticeship, traveled from town to town, seeking work and experience. Only after producing a masterpiece of work, demonstrating skill and craftsmanship, could a journeyman petition the guild to become a master, with the right to open their own workshop. Guilds controlled the quality of goods fiercely. They set standards for materials, techniques, and finished products. This ensured trust among customers, but also limited competition. Guilds regulated prices and production quantities, sometimes leading to stagnation or resistance to innovation. Guild halls were the physical and symbolic centers of guild life. Here, members met to discuss trade issues, settle disputes, and celebrate religious festivals. Guilds often sponsored charity, caring for sick members and their families. Beyond economics, guilds shaped social life. They were tightly woven into the fabric of urban communities, participating in public ceremonies and processions. Guild patron saints, such as Saint Crispin for shoemakers, were honored with annual feasts and rituals blending work, faith, and identity. This structure provided stability, but also imposed limits. The guild system made it difficult for outsiders, or women, to enter trades. It sometimes resisted technological changes that threatened traditional ways. By understanding the guild's inner workings, we uncover how medieval cities functioned, not just as centers of power or wealth, but as communities sustained by skilled hands and regulated labor. Yet, many questions remain. How did these artisans balance tradition with change? What challenges did they face in a world slowly evolving toward the modern era? Next, we will explore the lives of individual guild members, their daily routines, struggles, and the delicate balance between mastery and survival. Step inside a medieval workshop, the air thick with dust, smoke, and the smell of wood or metal. Here, the daily rhythm is measured by the repetitive sounds of hammer strikes, the scrape of tools against stone, and the focused murmurs of apprentices learning their trade. For members of the guilds, this was more than a workplace. It was a microcosm of medieval society, governed by strict rules and expectations. A master craftsman's workshop was often small and crowded. It served as a workspace, classroom, and sometimes even a home. Tools were precious and carefully maintained. Raw materials had to be sourced and stored properly. Every step in the production process was watched closely by the master, ensuring that apprentices and journeymen learned the correct techniques. The workday began at first light, often lasting until sunset, with breaks dictated by the seasons and religious festivals. Sundays and feast days offered rare respite, where work halted in observance of church obligations. Despite the long hours, the pace was deliberate. Careless mistakes could ruin materials and damage reputations. Apprentices, usually bound for 5 to 7 years, performed menial tasks like cleaning tools and preparing materials before gradually learning complex skills. They lived under the authority of their master, who controlled not only their work but often their personal lives. This arrangement was strict but necessary for passing down knowledge in a time without formal schools. Journeymen, on the other hand, enjoyed more independence. They traveled to expand their skills, find better work, or save money toward the day they could become masters themselves. However, this life was precarious. Without guild membership, journeymen faced limited rights and economic insecurity, relying on temporary work and favor. Masters carried heavy responsibilities beyond their craft. They managed workshop finances, negotiated contracts, and maintained relationships within the guild. They also trained apprentices and ensured compliance with guild rules, sometimes acting as enforcers during disputes. Guild regulations extended beyond quality control. They imposed moral and social expectations, forbidding members from engaging in dishonest practices or work outside the trade. Violations could result in fines, public shaming, or expulsion, devastating consequences in a tightly knit community. Despite these constraints, workshops were places of creativity and innovation. Skilled craftsmen experimented with new techniques or styles, sometimes pushing the boundaries of guild rules. Patronage from wealthy clients or the church provided opportunities for ambitious projects, like intricately carved altarpieces or finely wrought metalwork. Economic pressures, however, were ever present. Poor harvests, political instability, or plague outbreaks could reduce demand for luxury goods. Guild members often had to balance artistic ambition with survival, adapting their trades to changing markets. The social life within the guild was rich. Members celebrated feast days with communal meals and religious ceremonies, reinforcing bonds and shared identity. These occasions also served as opportunities for networking and securing future commissions. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Apprentices chafed under strict discipline. Journeymen longed for stability, and masters guarded their privileges jealously. The guild system, while fostering community and quality, also created hierarchies that could stifle upward mobility. As you imagine the clang of hammer on anvil and the flicker of candlelight in a dim workshop, consider the countless hands that shaped medieval life, hands that built, repaired, and beautified a world long vanished. What stories lie hidden in the worn tools and weathered faces of these artisans? How did they navigate the tension between tradition and change in an era on the brink of transformation? As the Middle Ages progressed, the guild system that had so thoroughly organized urban craft and trade began to encounter new challenges. The slow march of technological innovation, shifts in economic power, and social changes tested the guild's ability to maintain control over their crafts and, in many cases, led to their gradual decline. Guilds were by design conservative institutions rooted in tradition and cautious of change. Their rules emphasized preserving established methods and protecting the privileges of existing members. Innovation was often viewed with suspicion, especially if it threatened established masters or undermined quality standards. However, external pressures, such as the rise of market economies, increased trade between regions, and the emergence of new industries challenged guild authority. Merchants and entrepreneurs who operated outside the guild system sometimes introduced mass production or cheaper goods, disrupting traditional craft monopolies. Political changes also affected guilds. In some cities, rulers supported guilds as stabilizing social forces. In others, central authorities curtailed guild privileges to foster freer markets or tax revenues. The Black Death and recurring plagues drastically reduced populations, causing labor shortages that shifted power dynamics between workers and employers. Despite these pressures, guilds left a lasting legacy. They created structured systems for vocational training, ensuring the transmission of skills across generations. The standards they set helped build trust in urban economies, enabling cities to flourish. Guilds also contributed to the social fabric of medieval towns. Their charitable work, religious observances, and festivals knitted communities together, embedding craftsmen within the civic identity. Their halls, often impressive architectural features, symbolized the pride and importance of craft in medieval life. For individual artisans, guild membership meant more than economic security. It was a source of identity and belonging. The rituals of apprenticeship, the attainment of mastery, and participation in guild events marked life's milestones, connecting personal journeys to larger social structures. The decline of guilds in the later medieval and early modern periods did not erase their influence. Many modern professional organizations trade unions, and vocational schools trace their roots to guild traditions. Moreover, the values of quality, skill, and community continue to resonate. Reflecting on the quiet, often overlooked lives of medieval artisans invites us to reconsider how history is shaped, not only by kings and battles, but by everyday labor and the hands that create and sustain societies. What can the resilience and adaptation of guild members teach us about navigating change in our own times? How do we balance tradition and innovation while preserving community and craftsmanship? Imagine a world where every book, every letter, and every official document was painstakingly copied by hand. This was the reality before Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, a time when knowledge was scarce, expensive, and largely confined to monasteries, universities, and the elite. Books were created by scribes, who worked in scriptoriums, often rooms in monasteries, painstakingly transcribing texts with quills on vellum or parchment. The process was slow, meticulous, and prone to human error. Each copy could take months or even years, making books precious and rare commodities. The materials used were costly. Vellum, made from animal skins, required careful preparation. Inks had to be mixed from organic and mineral components, and illumination decorative artwork in manuscripts sated time and expense. Because of these factors, books were often treasured possessions, accessible only to clergy, nobility, or wealthy merchants. Knowledge was thus closely guarded, limiting the spread of ideas. Literacy rates were low, and access to learning was restricted by social class and geography. The transmission of information depended on slow, manual reproduction, which could distort or delay texts. Even for the growing universities, acquiring texts was challenging. Copies had to be commissioned, sometimes imported from distant lands. Errors in transcription accumulated over generations, leading to conflicting versions of works. Yet, the demand for books and knowledge was growing. The Renaissance's early stirrings and the expansion of trade and scholarship created pressure for more efficient ways to produce and distribute texts. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of movable type in Mainz, Germany, changed this dynamic. But before the press revolutionized the world, it is important to understand the painstaking world that preceded it. How did the slow and fragile system of manuscript production shape medieval culture and knowledge? What were the implications of this scarcity for education, religion, and power? In the next section, we will explore Gutenberg's innovation, the technology, the challenges he faced, and how his press began to transform Europe's intellectual landscape. Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press around 1440 marked a profound turning point in the history of communication. But its development was neither instantaneous nor straightforward. To understand the quiet revolution it sparked, we must examine the details of the technology, the challenges Gutenberg faced, and the gradual spread of the press across Europe. Before Gutenberg, block printing existed, carving entire pages into wooden blocks, but this method was slow, costly, and inflexible. Gutenberg's innovation was to create individual, movable metal type pieces, each representing a single letter or character. These pieces could be rearranged and reused to form different pages, vastly increasing efficiency and reducing costs. The The movable type was cast using a hand mold, a precise but delicate process. Gutenberg combined this with oil-based ink, specially formulated to adhere well to metal and transfer clearly to paper or vellum. The press itself borrowed from existing technology used in wine and olive oil production, adapting a screw press to apply uniform pressure during printing. Despite these advancements, Gutenberg's journey was fraught with obstacles. Funding was a major challenge. Printing required expensive materials and equipment, and Gutenberg initially partnered with financiers who eventually sued him over debts. Legal battles forced him to relinquish control of his press before he could fully capitalize on his invention. His most famous work, the Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and technological innovation. It combined the clarity and uniformity of printed text with the beauty and reverence of hand-copied manuscripts, even featuring spaces left for hand-drawn illumination. The impact of the press began quietly. Early printed books were expensive and aimed primarily at wealthy clients, churches, and universities. Yet, the speed and relative ease of production meant more copies could be made than ever before. Within decades, printing presses spread throughout Europe, from Italy to France, England, and beyond, fueling the Renaissance's flourishing of art, science, and literature. The ability to produce large quantities of texts enabled the standardization of knowledge and the rapid dissemination of new ideas. However, this new power to spread information also stirred anxieties. Religious authorities worried about uncontrolled distribution of heretical or dissenting ideas. Political powers feared the challenge to established order posed by the free flow of information. The printing press, in its quiet, mechanical worry, began to reshape the intellectual, religious, and social fabric of Europe in ways previously unimaginable. What did this shift mean for those who had relied on the exclusivity of knowledge? How did ordinary people begin to engage with ideas once reserved for the elite? In the next section, we will explore the broader consequences of Gutenberg's invention, from the Reformation to the scientific revolution, and consider its lasting legacy in today's world of information. The invention of the printing press did more than speed up the production of books. It transformed the very fabric of European society, setting off waves of change that rippled across religion, science, politics, and culture. The quiet hum of the press marked the beginning of an information revolution. One of the most profound effects was the democratization of knowledge. Books became more accessible, less costly, and more widespread. This allowed not just scholars and clergy, but merchants, students, and eventually broader segments of society to engage with ideas and information. The printing press played a pivotal role in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, initially intended as an academic critique, spread rapidly across Europe thanks to printed copies. For the first time, religious ideas could be debated openly and widely, undermining the Catholic Church's control over doctrine and sparking religious upheaval. Science too benefited immensely. Printed works allowed scientists to share discoveries and build upon each other's knowledge with unprecedented speed. The Renaissance's revival of classical texts was facilitated by printing, as was the dissemination of new scientific methods during the scientific revolution. Political ideas and news began circulating more widely, challenging existing power structures. Pamphlets and broadsheets informed and mobilized citizens, planting seeds for future revolutions. And the rise of public opinion. The press also contributed to the standardization of language. By producing consistent texts in vernacular languages, it helped shape national identities and foster literacy among common people. Yet, the press was not without its challenges. Authorities attempted to control printing through censorship and licensing, fearful of its power to spread dissent. The struggle between control and freedom of information continues into the modern digital age, reflecting on Gutenberg's invention. It's clear that the printing press was not just a machine, but a catalyst for profound societal transformation. It shifted knowledge from the guarded hands of the few to the curious minds of many, reshaping how we learn, communicate, and think. As you consider the quiet turning of Gutenberg's press, ask yourself, how does this early revolution in information compare to our current digital era? What lessons about access, control, and the spread of ideas can we draw from the past to better understand our present and future? When you think of Roman soldiers, images of fierce battles, disciplined formations, and grand conquests often come to mind. Yet, much of a Roman legionary's life was spent far from the clamor of warfare in camps, on marches, or engaged in mundane daily tasks. To truly understand their world, we need to explore the recruitment, training, and structure that shaped these men and their enduring military machine. Roman legions were composed of citizen soldiers, initially volunteers drawn from Roman citizens who met certain property qualifications. Over time, as the Republic grew into empire, recruitment broadened, incorporating non-citizens, auxiliaries, and specialized units. But during the height of Rome's power, legions remained a backbone of Roman society, embodying discipline, loyalty, and martial skill. From the moment a recruit joined, rigorous training was paramount. The legions demanded physical endurance, precise drill, and mastery of weapons. New soldiers, known as triremes, learned to march long distances carrying heavy gear. Training was repetitive and exacting, focusing on instilling reflexes and teamwork rather than individual heroics. Discipline was enforced strictly. Punishments for infractions ranged from extra duties to flogging or worse. The goal was a cohesive fighting force where every soldier understood his role. Roman military camps, or castra, were carefully planned fortified sites. Soldiers lived in barracks with strict routines for hygiene, maintenance, and guard duty. Away from battle, they constructed roads, forts, and other infrastructure essential to Rome's expansion. The legion was divided into centuries and cohorts, with ranks from the common legionary to officers like centurions. These leaders were crucial in maintaining order and morale, often selected for their experience and leadership abilities rather than birthright. Pay was modest but consistent, supplemented by the promise of spoils or land grants after service. Soldiers served long terms, often 20 to 25 years, forging bonds and a shared identity that extended beyond the battlefield. Understanding the preparation and daily life of these soldiers sheds light on how Rome maintained its military dominance. Their success wasn't just in battles won, but in the routine, discipline, and resilience built day by day. What was it like for an individual soldier to live under such strict conditions, and how did they cope with the balance between duty and personal life? How did these men view their place within the vast Roman system? In the next section, we will delve deeper into the daily routines, challenges, and experiences that shaped the life of a Roman legionary off the battlefield. Imagine waking each morning inside a Roman castrum, the legionary camp, as the first light filters through the sturdy wooden barracks. For a Roman soldier, much of daily life revolved around routine, discipline, and a shared sense of purpose that helped sustain them far from home and amidst the rigors of military service. After a brisk morning roll call and inspection, the day began with physical training, marching exercises to build stamina, weapons drills to maintain skill, and strength conditioning. These activities were often conducted under the watchful eye of centurions, whose role was as much about enforcing discipline as mentoring younger soldiers. Much of the soldiers' time was also devoted to camp duties. These included maintaining fortifications, repairing walls, digging trenches, and setting up defensive structures. They built roads and bridges that not only facilitated military movement, but also contributed to Rome's lasting infrastructure legacy. Meals were simple but vital. The typical diet included staples like barley, porridge, pools, bread, salted pork, cheese, and occasionally fresh vegetables or fruits when available. Water was rationed carefully, and wine was diluted to ensure it lasted longer. Soldiers learned to survive with minimal luxuries, their meals fueling long days of work and discipline. Camaraderie within the legion was essential. Shared hardships and training fostered strong bonds between soldiers, creating a sense of brotherhood that could sustain morale during long campaigns. Soldiers often shared stories of home, their hopes and fears, creating a social fabric that balanced the rigid hierarchy of military life. Yet, the life of a legionary was far from easy. Harsh discipline could include punishments like decimation, a brutal penalty, where 1 in every 10 men was executed for collective failure or mutiny. Illness and injury were common, exacerbated by crowded living conditions and harsh environments. The psychological strain was significant. Soldiers endured separation from families for years, uncertainty about the future, and the constant threat of combat. Letters and small gifts from loved ones were treasured lifelines, and religious rituals provided comfort and a sense of protection. During times of peace, soldiers often served as law enforcement or laborers, maintaining order in Roman provinces and contributing to civil projects. Their presence was a reminder of Rome's reach and authority, blending military and civil roles. The legionaries' world was one of paradoxes: strict order paired with intense loyalty, brutal discipline balanced by deep camaraderie. This balance helped sustain Rome's military might and influence for centuries. What personal stories and struggles lie behind the uniform? How did individual soldiers reconcile the demands of duty with their own hopes and humanity? In the final section, we will explore the legacy of the Roman legionaries, their impact on military history, and the echoes of their daily lives that resonate today. The Roman legionary was not just a soldier. He was a cornerstone of an empire that spanned continents and centuries. The discipline, structure, and daily life routines of these men were fundamental to Rome's ability to project power and maintain order across vast territories. But their influence extends far beyond the battlefield and the borders of the ancient empire. By living under strict discipline and enduring rigorous training, legionaries created a military culture that has inspired armies throughout history. The organization of the legion, with its clear hierarchy and specialized roles, served as a model for countless armies in Europe and beyond for centuries. The Roman approach to soldier welfare, including provisions for pay, land grants, and retirement, laid early foundations for military professionalism. Many veterans settled in colonies across the empire, spreading Roman culture, language, and infrastructure in their wake, thus shaping the social and economic fabric of newly conquered regions. Beyond their military achievements, legionaries contributed to the building of roads, aqueducts, and cities that still stand today as testaments to Roman engineering and vision. Their daily labor in constructing these vital structures blended the roles of soldier and citizen, embodying the empire's pragmatic spirit. The experience of legionaries also offers insights into the personal human dimension of empire men who grappled with the hardships of service, the tension between duty and family, and the search for meaning within a massive political system. The legacy of the Roman soldier can be felt in modern military traditions, discipline, and even in the cultural imagination of what it means to serve. Their stories remind us that behind every empire are countless individual lives shaped by routine, resilience, and adaptation. As we reflect on the daily grind of Roman legionaries, consider how ordinary routines, marching, drilling, repairing, sharing meals can sustain great enterprises. How do the small, repetitive actions of individuals build the foundations for history's grand narratives? And finally, how might the lives of these ancient soldiers help us understand the balance between personal sacrifice and collective achievement in our own lives and societies? When you think of the Great Wall of China, what likely comes to mind are towering fortifications stretching across rugged mountains, symbols of imperial might and protection. But behind these vast stone and earthworks lies the story of thousands upon thousands of laborers, farmers, soldiers, convicts whose daily toil shaped one of history's most remarkable feats of engineering. The earliest sections of what would become the Great Wall were constructed during the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, as competing states built walls to defend their territories from raids and invasions. However, it was under the Qin dynasty, around 221 BCE, when Emperor Qin Shi Huang unified China, that the first major effort to link and extend these walls began. His aim was to create a massive barrier against northern nomadic tribes. Building such a colossal structure was a monumental task. The terrain was often harsh, ranging from arid deserts to steep mountain ridges. Laborers had to quarry stone, haul earth, and assemble walls using rudimentary tools and sheer human strength. Unlike armies marching to battle, these workers faced months or years of grueling physical labor with little respite. The workforce was diverse. Many were conscripted peasants who had to leave their farms, disrupting agricultural cycles. Others were prisoners sentenced to forced labor. Soldiers were also involved, both as guards and as builders. Conditions were brutal. Harsh weather, inadequate food, disease, and accidents made the construction perilous. The purpose of the wall was not simply defensive, but also psychological, demarcating the boundary of the empire and symbolizing imperial authority. Its presence sent a message to both foreign enemies and domestic subjects about the reach and power of the Qin state. Despite the emperor's grand vision, the wall was incomplete at his death, and subsequent dynasties continued to expand, repair, and modify the structure. The Great Wall is thus not a single wall, but a series of walls built over centuries, reflecting shifting military needs and political ambitions. The sheer scale of this endeavor is staggering. Some estimates suggest that millions of workers contributed to the Great Wall's construction across different dynasties. Yet the stories of these laborers, their daily lives, struggles, and resilience remain largely silent in historical records. What motivated these workers to endure such hardship? How did their labor shape not only the wall, but the social fabric of the empire? And what does the Great Wall tell us about the relationship between power, control, and human cost in ancient China? In the next section, we will explore the everyday realities faced by these laborers, their routines, challenges, and survival strategies amid one of history's most ambitious construction projects. Imagine waking before dawn with only the faint glow of early morning light as you prepare for another grueling day of labor on the Great Wall. For the countless men conscripted to build this vast frontier, daily life was a blend of exhaustion, danger, and determination, set against the backdrop of one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history. Most workers were peasants who had been drafted from their homes and farms, often for months or years at a time. This forced conscription interrupted the agricultural cycles that their families depended on, sometimes threatening food supplies, both for their households and the empire at large. Their workdays were long and punishing. Armed with simple tools, hammers, chisels, baskets, and rudimentary carts, they quarried stone from nearby mountains, carried earth and gravel over steep and rocky terrain, and mixed mortar by hand. In some stretches, they used rammed earth techniques, compacting soil layer by layer to form sturdy walls. The physical demands were immense. The laborers faced scorching summers, freezing winters, and unpredictable weather, often without proper shelter or clothing. Food rations were meager and insufficient, leaving many weak and susceptible to illness. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Collapsing walls, falls from cliffs, and tool injuries were common hazards. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded camps, with little access to medical care. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that the death toll during construction was staggering, though exact numbers remain unknown. Despite these harsh conditions, the workers found ways to endure. Social bonds formed among laborers, providing emotional support and moments of respite. Some engaged in small acts of creativity, carving symbols or inscriptions into stones, sharing folk songs, or trading stories from home. Military guards enforced discipline, and desertion was met with severe punishment. Yet, some workers took pride in their contribution, viewing the wall as a monument, not just of imperial power, but of their own resilience and labor. The impact on local communities was profound. With large portions of the workforce conscripted, villages faced labor shortages, economic disruption, and increased vulnerability to raids. The Great Wall was not only a physical barrier, but a social one, reshaping the lives of those who built it and the regions surrounding it. This monumental project highlights the often overlooked human cost behind grand historical achievements. The wall stands today as a testament not only to imperial ambition, but but to the endurance of ordinary people under extraordinary circumstances. What stories might have been lost in the mortar and stones? How do we honor the silent labor of those who built great monuments that shaped history, yet remain invisible to it? In the final section, we will examine the legacy of the Great Walls, builders, their place in history, and the continuing symbolism of their labor through the centuries. Today, when travelers walk along the Great Wall, they see a majestic and enduring monument stretching over mountains, valleys, and deserts. Its weathered stones speak of centuries gone by, yet they are silent about the millions of hands that placed them, the backs that bore them, and the lives given in its making. The workers who built the Great Wall rarely left their names in official records. Unlike emperors, generals, and architects whose deeds were chronicled, the peasants, soldiers, and prisoners remained anonymous. In some sections, archaeologists have uncovered small carvings marks, perhaps left by the builders themselves, hinting at a need to be remembered. However modestly, the Qin dynasty's original wall was just the beginning. Over the centuries, the Han, Ming, and other dynasties expanded, repaired, and reinforced the structure. Each phase brought new waves of laborers, repeating the cycle of hardship and toil. By the Ming period, 1368 to 1644, the wall was constructed largely with stone and bricks, involving an even more extensive network of workers and supply chains. Despite the immense human cost, the Great Wall fulfilled multiple purposes beyond defense. It acted as a political statement, defining the empire's limits and asserting authority over vast frontiers. It also regulated trade and migration, serving as a checkpoint for goods and people, especially along routes connected to the Silk Road. The legacy of its builders is twofold. First, they left behind one of the most enduring structures in human history, a physical embodiment of determination, skill, and cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Second, their story serves as a reminder of the countless unnamed individuals whose labor shapes civilizations, yet whose lives pass quietly into obscurity. In modern China, the Great Wall has become a symbol of national pride, perseverance, and unity. Tourists admire its grandeur. Scholars study its construction and history. Artists depict it as a poetic meeting of human ambition and natural landscape. Yet behind all these interpretations lies the truth that it is also a monument to human endurance under some of the harshest conditions imaginable. The stones may remain for centuries more, but the stories of the people who placed them can only be reconstructed in fragments. This raises a question that echoes beyond the wall itself. When we admire great works of history, how often do we consider the lives of those who made them possible? And in our own time, who are the builders whose hands shaped the monuments of the future? Before the age of paper, ink, and printing presses, long before the glow of screens and the tapping of keys, there were clay tablets and careful wedge-shaped marks pressed into their surfaces. This was cuneiform, one of the world's earliest systems of writing, born in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago. In the bustling city-states of Sumer around 3200 BCE, the first scribes emerged. They were not poets or storytellers at first, but record-keepers, people tasked with the decidedly unromantic work of tracking grain supplies, livestock, trade agreements, and taxes. Mesopotamia's growing cities needed a way to remember details. Too complex for memory alone, and clay, plentiful along the Tigris and Euphrates, became the perfect medium. The scribal profession was both respected and demanding. Training often began in early youth, with students entering Oedipus the tablet, houses or schools, where they learned the art of forming cuneiform signs. Lessons were rigorous, requiring endless repetition. Students memorized not only hundreds of signs, but also the conventions for arranging them, and the formulas for various kinds of documents. A scribe's toolkit was simple but essential: a stylus, often made of reed, and slabs of damp clay. Each stroke of the stylus was deliberate. Once the clay dried, the marks became permanent. Mistakes could be scraped away before drying, but accuracy was paramount. An incorrect sign could change the meaning of a record entirely. Scribes worked for temples, palaces, merchants, and sometimes private citizens. In temple complexes, they kept meticulous records of offerings, land holdings, and labor rosters. In palaces, they drafted laws, treaties, and correspondence between rulers. For merchants, they prepared contracts and inventories. Their role was administrative at its core, yet their work touched every aspect of society. The invention of writing also expanded the reach of power. A ruler's decrees could be standardized and disseminated. Laws could be fixed and consulted. Histories could be recorded to legitimize dynasties. But with every new tablet pressed and stored, the scribes became the silent custodians of civilization's memory. Still, not all cuneiform tablets were dry lists and contracts. Over time, scribes began to record myths, hymns, and epic tales, the Epic of Gilgamesh being among the most famous. But even these literary works were often preserved alongside mundane records, showing how closely the extraordinary and the ordinary coexisted in the scribal world. The rise of the scribe also changed the social landscape. Literacy was rare, and the ability to read and write placed scribes in a unique position between common laborers and the ruling elite. They were not rulers themselves, but their skill gave them influence, access, and sometimes mobility in the rigid hierarchies of Mesopotamian society. Yet for all their skill, the life of a scribe was far from leisurely. Hours of precise, repetitive work left hands cramped and eyes strained. Clay tablets could be heavy, storage rooms hot and dusty, and errors costly. Still, the role offered stability and prestige in a world where most people's labor was tied directly to the land. So what was it like to spend a lifetime turning damp clay into the written memory of a civilization? What rhythms and routines shaped a scribe's day, and how did their quiet work influence the rise and fall of cities? In the next section, we will step into the daily life of a Mesopotamian scribe, from the first light of morning to the last drying tablet of the day. The scribe's day began not with inspiration, but with routine. As the sun rose over the flat, fertile plains of Mesopotamia, its light glinting on irrigation canals and temple walls, the scribe prepared for another day of meticulous labor. In the early hours, while most farmers were already in the fields, scribes made their way to the administrative heart of the city, perhaps a temple precinct, palace courtyard, or merchant's counting room. If the scribe worked for a temple, the morning might begin with the review of offerings brought overnight: jars of oil, sacks of grain, baskets of dates. Each item was counted, measured, and entered into the official record. In an age without paper or ledgers, the scribes' clay tablets were the city's accounting books. Each tablet inscribed with neat columns of cuneiform signs. The process was slow and deliberate. The scribe would press the wedge-shaped stylus into the clay, angling each mark with practiced precision. The clay had to be just right, not too wet, or the marks would blur, not too dry, or the stylus would crack the surface. Apprentices often prepared the clay, kneading and shaping it into smooth, palm-sized slabs for their masters. Mid-morning might be devoted to correspondence. In royal courts, scribes recorded letters dictated by officials or rulers, addressing matters ranging from trade negotiations to border disputes. Because cuneiform writing was not just a language, but a complex system of symbols that could represent multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. The scribe had to be fluent in more than one linguistic tradition. The work required not only technical skill, but also an understanding of law, mathematics, and measurement systems. A scribe recording a land sale needed to calculate exact boundaries, often using the iku, about 3,600 square meters, as a unit of area. Errors could lead to disputes, and disputes could lead to the scribe being held personally responsible. By midday, the scribe might assist in sealing contracts. This involved pressing cylinder seals, engraved with intricate designs, into clay, to serve as signatures. The seals acted like personal stamps of identity, and each impression was as legally binding as a signature today. Scribes had to ensure these seals were placed correctly and that the text of the contract matched the agreement precisely. The afternoons often brought variety. Some days were spent copying older tablets, a form of archiving that preserved legal precedents, myths, or economic records. Other days, scribes documented shipments arriving from distant lands: timber from the Levant, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. In these moments, the scribe became a link between the local city and the farthest reaches of the known world. Evening meant reviewing the day's work, smoothing errors where possible, and placing the finished tablets in storage rooms, rows upon rows of clay shelves holding the city's collective memory. In the dry climate of Mesopotamia, many of these tablets hardened naturally, becoming nearly as durable as stone. The physical toll of the job was real. Hours hunched over clay left backs sore and eyes tired. Fingers and wrists stiffened from the constant grip of the stylus. And yet, for the scribe, there was satisfaction in knowing that their work preserved order in the city, tracking debts, confirming trades, and recording history itself. Still, there was a tension between their visibility and anonymity. Everyone knew the importance of the scribes, but few remembered their individual names unless they were tied to a great ruler or an unusual event. For most, their words outlived them, but their identities faded. How then did these scribes think about their own legacy? Did they see themselves as the guardians of civilization's memory, or simply as workers following orders in the service of others? In the next and final section, we'll explore the long-term legacy of Mesopotamian scribes, their influence on later civilizations, and the lasting impact of the wedge-shaped marks they left behind. When the last scribe of a city set down his stylus and the clay dried for the final time, his work often outlasted the very buildings in which it was written. This was the paradox of the scribal life in Mesopotamia. The writer might be forgotten, but the writing endured. Cuneiform tablets, especially those baked intentionally in kilns or accidentally in fires, became some of the most durable artifacts of the ancient world. Long after the mud brick walls of cities eroded into the dust, the tablets remained buried, waiting for modern archaeologists to unearth them. In these small slabs of clay, we find a complete cross-section of ancient life: court cases, tax lists, mathematical problems, diplomatic treaties, hymns, and epic poetry. Through these writings, we can trace how the scribes shaped civilization. They formalized laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, which was inscribed in cuneiform for all to see. They recorded astronomical observations that would inform later Greek and Islamic scholars. They preserved stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which still moves readers more than 4 millennia later. Even in practical matters, their influence reached far beyond Mesopotamia. The habit of keeping written records borne to Egypt, the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and beyond. Later writing systems borrowed and adapted cuneiform signs, or the very idea of writing itself, for their own languages. The scribal tradition became a blueprint for how complex societies managed information. For the scribes themselves, there was pride in their profession. In school texts, some boast about the privileges of literacy. The scribe sits in the shade, not in the sun. His hands are clean, not calloused from the plow. Such words reveal an awareness of their special role in life, apart from manual labor, yet still demanding in its own right. But there was also humility built into their work. Few scribes expected fame. Most knew their names would fade, even if their words endured. This acceptance of anonymity gave their writing an almost selfless quality. They wrote not for themselves, but for the continuity of the city, the temple, the kingdom. And so, when we look at a tablet in a museum today, we are seeing more than just ancient marks on clay. We are touching the mental labor of a person who lived thousands of years ago, a person whose eyes scanned the same symbols, whose fingers pressed the same impressions, whose world was as vivid to them as ours is to us. The scribes of Mesopotamia were, in their quiet way, architects of human memory. Without them, vast portions of our shared past would simply vanish into silence. Their work reminds us that history is not only made by kings and warriors, but also by those who wrote down the deeds, counted the grain, and catalogued the days. It leaves us with a simple but profound question. In 1,000 years, whose records of our own time will remain, and who will be the silent scribes of our age? If you stood on the dusty road outside Susa around 500 BCE, you might see a rider in bright livery thundering past. This was no wandering travel. He was part of the royal courier system of the Achaemenid Empire, riding the royal road, one of the most advanced communication routes in the ancient world. The road's most famous patron, Darius I, ruled an empire so vast it stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, from the mountains of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. Administering such a vast space required more than soldiers and governors. It demanded speed, efficiency, and a way to bridge enormous distances without losing control. The answer was infrastructure. The royal road was the backbone of the empire's administrative system, extending more than 1,500 miles about 2,400 kilometers between Susa and Sardis. It linked key cities and provinces. Smaller connecting roads fed into this main artery, creating a web that covered the empire. The road was not built entirely from scratch. Many sections followed older trade and military routes used by earlier kingdoms like the Assyrians. But under Darius the network was standardized and maintained to an unprecedented degree. Way stations, often called posting houses, were placed at intervals along the road, stocked with fresh horses and provisions for royal messengers. The couriers themselves were part of an elite service, known in Greek accounts as the angarion system. These riders relayed messages at remarkable speed for the ancient world. Herodotus claimed that messages could travel the entire length of the road in just 7 days, a journey that might take a civilian caravan 3 months. Passing the dispatch to the next, with horses ready and waiting. The road was more than a messenger. It was a symbol of imperial unity. Along its length, goods and people moved in a controlled flow. Tax revenues traveled from provinces to the imperial treasury. Soldiers marched to frontier posts, and merchants carried goods under the protection of Persian law. In this way, the royal road tied together not just geography, but also economies and cultures. News of rebellions, invasions, or administrative failures could reach him quickly, allowing for swift action. It was a tool for projecting power over lands that might otherwise drift beyond the empire's reach. But behind the efficiency lay the quieter details, the toll of constant road maintenance, the challenges of feeding horses at each station, the coordination of so many riders across so many miles. It was a logistical achievement built not just on royal command, but on the daily, repetitive work of thousands of ordinary people. So, what was it like to actually travel this road, not as a royal courier in a blur of speed, but as an ordinary traveler, merchant, or scribe? How did the royal road feel underfoot, and what rhythms of life did it carry along its length? In the next section, we will walk a mile or perhaps 100 in the dust of the king's highway. Travel on the royal road was not a single experience. It depended on who you were, why you traveled, and how much silver you had in your purse. For the royal couriers, the road was a controlled blur of speed. For merchants and ordinary travelers, it was a long, dusty ribbon stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Let us begin in Susa, the Persian capital, for much of the year. Merchants here might load their pack animals, mules, or camels, with goods bound for Anatolia. Spices from India, fine Persian textiles, and gold jewelry could be found alongside Babylonian glassware and Assyrian bronze. Each caravan gathered its guards, for although the empire prided itself on order, bandits still haunted the edges of the road. These were the productive heartlands of the empire, and their surplus kept both soldiers and couriers supplied. The rhythm of travel became predictable. Walk for several hours, pause in the shade, water the animals, move on again. For the royal messengers, there was little rest. At each posting station, a fresh horse waited, often already saddled. The exhausted animal was led away, and the courier took off immediately. These stations were maintained at the empire's expense, requiring a steady supply of fodder, water, and workers. Stable hands, grooms, and administrators lived at these outposts year-round, their lives revolving around the comings and goings of riders. The road itself varied in quality. In others, it was little more than a packed hearth track worn smooth by countless hooves and sandals. In the busier sections, you might pass soldiers marching to frontier garrisons, priests traveling between temples, or provincial officials carrying tax records to the capital. Greek merchants, Phoenician sailors, Egyptian scribes from across the known world mingled here. The road became a place where cultures overlapped, even if briefly, in the common act of movement. Travel was not without risks. Weather could be harsh, with blazing heat in summer and freezing winds in winter. Streams could swell without warning, washing away small bridges. A lame pack animal could delay a caravan for days. Yet the very existence of the road reduced many of these dangers. Travelers knew where the next water source would be, and the regular flow of traffic deterred much of the lawlessness that plagued more remote paths. Even for those not moving along it, the road shaped daily life. Villages near its path might grow wealthy from travelers buying food, fodder, and repairs. Inns sprung up, offering shelter in exchange for coin. Craftsmen sold leather sandals, animal tack, and clay drinking vessels. The road was not just a physical connection, it was an economic lifeline. Still, for all its practical benefits, the road carried with it an invisible weight, the constant reminder of imperial reach. A provincial governor might look down the road and see opportunity, but also the possibility of the king's swift reprisal if loyalty wavered. To live along the royal road was to live under the watchful eye of the Achaemenid state. And yet, despite all its order and structure, the road was only as effective as the people who maintained and used it. The couriers were swift, but they could only carry what was given to them. The stations were sturdy, but they depended on supplies from nearby communities. Even the king himself relied on countless unseen hands to keep his great artery of empire beating. But what happened when that artery was disrupted? When the couriers stopped, the stations fell silent, and the road began to crumble. In the final section, we will look at the fate of the royal road after the fall of the Persian Empire, and how its influence stretched far beyond the time of Darius. No empire lasts forever. For the royal road, the decline came not from a sudden collapse, but from the slow shifting of power and purpose. When Alexander the Great swept through the Persian Empire in the late 4th century BCE, he found much of the road system intact. His armies marched along its routes, using the same stations and supplies that had once fed the couriers of Darius. The road served a conqueror just as well as it had served the king who built it. Alexander's administrators, in turn, adapted it to the needs of their new territories. But once the Achaemenid system was gone, the careful maintenance began to falter. Some stations fell into disrepair. Others were abandoned entirely. Without a centralized authority funding and organizing the upkeep, stretches of the road deteriorated. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Paving stones were stolen for nearby buildings, and in some regions, overgrowth slowly claimed the path. Yet the idea of the royal road lingered. Successor states, Seleucid, Parthian, and later Sassanid, recognized the value of a unified communication route. They repaired and rebuilt sections, sometimes altering the course to suit new political or military priorities. Even under Roman rule in parts of the Near East, the concept of a post road remained essential. The deeper legacy of the royal road was not just physical, it was conceptual. Darius had demonstrated that with the right infrastructure, a ruler could govern a vast and culturally diverse empire more efficiently. The principles behind his road regular way stations, relay couriers, standardized routes reappeared in the Roman cursus publicus, in the Mongol yam system, and even in the early European postal routes of the Renaissance. Archaeologists today can still trace parts of its route. In Turkey, stretches of ancient paving are visible along old trade paths. In Iran, certain valleys follow the same corridors once used by Darius's couriers. Inscriptions and ruins of posting stations hint at the network's scale and the labor that sustained it, carrying a sealed message marked with the authority of the great king. That writer might have been bringing news of victory, reports of a harvest, or orders for a distant satrap. The road also left an imprint on the people who lived alongside it. Markets grew around its traffic. Villages expanded where way stations brought a steady flow of visitors. In this sense, the royal road was more than an imperial tool. It was a living ecosystem of human connection. By the time the last echoes of the Persian Empire faded, the royal road had already fulfilled its purpose. It had stitched together an empire of many tongues and cultures, turning distant provinces into parts of a whole. The road may have crumbled, but the model it provided for governance and communication endured. And in this, perhaps, lies the quiet truth. Infrastructure outlives the ambitions of kings. The stones and paths may change, but the need to connect to, send word across the miles remains. It makes you wonder, in our own age of digital messages sent in seconds, which of our systems will still be remembered 2,000 years from now, and which will fade like dust on an untraveled road? In the early centuries of the Roman Empire, if you wanted to read something, you wouldn't pick up a book as we know it. You would unroll a scroll made of papyrus imported from Egypt, or, later, parchment from animal skins. Scrolls were the dominant format for literature, legal records, and personal correspondence. They were elegant, but also awkward, bulky, fragile, and difficult to navigate. Reading a scroll meant unrolling it from one end while rolling it up on the other, keeping the portion you wanted visible in the middle. Finding a particular passage could be a slow, almost meditative process. Ancient libraries kept rows upon rows of these scrolls, each labeled with a small tag to identify its contents. The great libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum may have held hundreds of thousands of them, a rolling sea of information. Yet, sometime around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, a quiet transformation began. In workshops, scribes started folding parchment sheets and stitching them together along one side. Instead of rolling, you could turn pages. Instead of searching for a passage by unrolling yards of material, you could flip directly to the spot. This was the codex, the ancestor of the modern book. At first, the codex was far from universal. Scrolls had centuries of tradition behind them, and many scholars and officials were slow to adopt the new form. But the codex offered practical advantages that were hard to ignore. It could hold more text in a smaller space, making it lighter and easier to carry. It protected its writing surface between covers, helping preserve its contents. And it allowed writing on both sides of the page, doubling efficiency. The shift to the codex was not driven solely by convenience. Religious communities, particularly Early Christians were quick to embrace the format. A codex could contain an entire collection of scriptures in one volume, something nearly impossible with scrolls. Missionaries carrying the Gospels could travel with a single portable book rather than a heavy bundle of scrolls. This quiet innovation began to change how people interacted with text. With a codex, marginal notes could be added more easily. Pages could be numbered. Readers could cross-reference passages with greater speed. In essence, the codex made reading more dynamic, less a linear unfolding, more a flexible exploration. Still, in the first generations of its existence, the codex was a curiosity. Elite Roman households might have both scrolls and codices in their libraries, with the latter seen as something of a novelty. But novelty can be persistent, especially when it makes life easier. And so the question emerges, how did this one format go from a niche choice to the dominant way humans have stored and read long-form writing for nearly 2,000 years? In the next section, we will trace the codex's gradual rise in popularity and the surprisingly practical forces that pushed it to overtake the scroll. The codex did not conquer the scroll overnight. In the early Roman Empire, tradition still held sway. Public readings in forums, Senate sessions, and literary gatherings continued to rely on scrolls, which had a certain grandeur when unfurled before an audience. Wealthy patrons liked to display scrolls as a sign of learning and refinement. All scrolls had been the medium of Homer, Cicero, and Virgil. But change often begins in the margins, both literal and metaphorical. The codex first took root among communities that valued practicality over ceremony. Early Christians found it easier to compile the multiple writings that formed the New Testament into one codex rather than keep them in separate scrolls. Legal clerks discovered they could store more information per unit of space, and that flipping to a particular law was far quicker in a codex. Travelers appreciated the durability. Pages stitched into a binding were less likely to unravel or tear than a long scroll exposed to wind and dust. There were also economic considerations. Parchment, though more expensive than papyrus, was sturdier. In a codex, the ability to write on both sides of a sheet effectively doubled its value. And in an age when papyrus had to be imported from Egypt to process subject to trade disruptions, parchment, made from locally available animal skins, gave regions more control over their supply of writing material. By the 3rd century CE, codices were being used for everything from personal notebooks to military records. Roman soldiers stationed at distant frontiers carried codices containing orders, rosters, and logistical notes. Merchants kept codex-style account books to track debts and shipments. The codex's portability made it ideal for these roles tucked under an arm. It could go from camp to camp, market to market, without the fragility of a scroll. This practicality had a subtle cultural effect. Scrolls, with their ceremonial handling, encouraged reading in large blocks. One sat down to consume a work in long sessions. Codices, however, were well suited to shorter, more targeted reading. A scholar might flip directly to a section of Aristotle, a lawyer to a specific precedent, a priest to a particular psalm. This shift in reading habits mirrored the flexibility of the medium. The codex also opened new possibilities in design. Early examples sometimes included rudimentary tables of contents or section markers. Decorative covers made of wood or leather offered protection and a sense of permanence. Later, illuminated manuscripts would push this artistry even further. But even in its early days, the codex's physical form invited personalization in a way the uniform scroll did not. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century CE, the codex was already a favored format among Christian communities. The emperor himself reportedly commissioned multiple lavish codices of the Bible for churches in Constantinople. These imperial endorsements accelerated the format's prestige. Still, the scroll was not gone yet. In the libraries of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, scrolls continued to line the shelves. Many classical works would not be copied into codex form for centuries, and the sheer number of scrolls already in existence ensured their survival for a time. But momentum had shifted. The codex had proven itself more than a novelty. It was a tool that matched the increasingly complex and interconnected world of the late empire. The real tipping point was coming, and when it did, the scroll would pass from a living tradition into an object of antiquarian curiosity. The question is, what moment, or combination of moments, finally pushed the codex from contender to champion, sealing the scroll's fate? By the 5th century CE, the codex had moved from the edges of Roman society to its center. Libraries were reorganizing to store the rectangular volumes, and scribes in monasteries were filling their scriptoria with folded, stitched pages rather than long rolls of papyrus. The turning point came not with a single decree, but with the convergence of three forces: religion, economy, and practicality. First, religion. As Christianity spread throughout the empire and beyond, the codex became its standard medium. The Bible, church liturgies, theological treatises all were compiled in codex form. This preference wasn't arbitrary. Christian reading habits often involved moving between different passages to make connections, something far easier with a bound book. The codex's durability also suited a faith that valued the preservation of sacred texts for generations. By adopting the codex early, the Church tied its identity to the format, ensuring that wherever Christianity traveled, the codex traveled to. Second, the economy of materials. Papyrus production, centered in Egypt, was increasingly disrupted by political instability and shifting trade patterns. Parchment, made from animal skins, was more costly but could be sourced locally across much of Europe and the Near East. In a codex, the double-sided writing surface made parchment more efficient than in a scroll where only one side could be used. In lean times, scribes even scraped old codex pages clean to reuse them, creating the layered documents we now call palimpsests. Third, practicality in an empire under strain. By the late empire, communication networks were stretched thin, military campaigns were frequent, and administration required ever more portable and accessible record-keeping. The codex fit these needs perfectly. Scrolls, elegant in ceremonial settings, were cumbersome on a battlefield or in a traveling court. A codex could be opened and read on a horse, or stored more easily in a chest. The decline of the scroll wasn't total poetry. Plays and some formal documents continued in scroll form for a while, especially in the Byzantine East. But each year, fewer new scrolls were produced, and more old works were copied into codex form. By the early medieval period, the scroll was largely relegated to ritual or symbolic uses. The transition had lasting consequences. The codex reshaped how people interacted with text. It encouraged annotations, indexing, and cross-referencing. It allowed for private, quiet reading, as a person could more easily hold a codex alone than manage a long scroll. It also changed how texts were transmitted. Whole collections could be copied together, preserving works that might have been lost if left as separate scrolls. Even the mental metaphor of reading shifted. The scroll suggested a continuous journey, unrolling from a fixed beginning to an end. The codex suggested a landscape one could move around in, flipping forward or backward at will. This conceptual change, in turn, influenced scholarship, legal thinking, and even storytelling. Today, the scroll survives in ceremonial Torah readings, in certain archival formats, and in the digital scrolling we do on screens, though the latter is a metaphor, more than a material reality. But the book, in its codex form, remains the standard for most of the world, a quiet testament to a choice made nearly 2 millennia ago. And so the question lingers, in an age of e-readers and endless online text, are we living through another slow transition, one future historians will describe as the moment the codex began to yield its long-held place? Today, salt is so common that we scatter it without a thought over food, across icy roads, even into swimming pools. In the ancient world, however, salt was both precious and indispensable. The Romans understood this better than most. For them, salt was not merely a seasoning, but a necessity for survival, preservation, and even empire building. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the most reliable way to preserve food. Fish, meat, and certain vegetables could be kept edible for months if properly salted. Roman armies on long campaigns relied on salted pork and fish sauce garum to feed themselves. Without salt, a legion's supply chain would collapse in weeks. But salt's importance went beyond food. It was essential in tanning leather, curing olives, making certain medicines, and even in religious rituals. Livy, the Roman historian, claimed that early Roman society saw salt as a gift worthy of the gods. It was sprinkled on sacrificial animals, mixed into ceremonial bread, and used in purification rites. This demand made salt a commodity of strategic value. Saltworks dotted the Italian coastline, where seawater was evaporated in shallow pans. Inland, brine springs were tapped, and rock salt was quarried from mountains. But to make the most of these resources, Rome needed something else: roads. One of the earliest and most important Roman roads was the Via Salaria, literally, the Salt Road. It stretched from the salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River inland to the Sabine Hills, where brine springs were worked and traded. The Via Salaria was older than the empire itself, possibly dating back to the time when Rome was little more than a cluster of huts on the Palatine Hill. The road wasn't just for trade. It was also a corridor of culture and control. Merchants, soldiers, and tax collectors moved along it, bringing not only goods but also Roman law, language, and customs to the interior. Over time, more salt roads radiated from Rome, connecting the capital with far-flung regions. Salt was so valuable that it influenced Roman pay. The Latin word salarium originally referred to an allowance given to soldiers so they could purchase salt. Over time, the term came to mean any regular payment, giving us the modern word salary. Traveling along a salt road in ancient Rome was not glamorous. The journey was dusty in summer, muddy in winter, and occasionally dangerous. Merchants might hire guards to protect against bandits, especially in remote stretches. Carts loaded with heavy sacks of salt moved slowly, their iron-bound wheels grinding grooves into the stone paving. Inns offered food, rest, and stabling, but they were often noisy and overpriced. Yet the salt roads endured. Even after the Roman Empire fractured, many of these ancient routes continued to be used, carrying not just salt, but all manner of goods. In some parts of Italy, modern highways still follow their course. The Via Salaria reminds us that some of the most important infrastructure in history was built not for gold, silver, or silk but for something as small and ordinary as the grains we now shake from a table dispenser. Still, there is a deeper story. Hear how Rome's appetite for salt influenced its military campaigns, settlement patterns, and even the founding myths of certain cities. And that story is where we turn next. Salt's role in Rome was not just economic, it was strategic. Control of salt supplies could mean the difference between loyalty and rebellion, especially in remote provinces where food security was fragile. For the Romans, securing salt sources was as critical as guarding gold mines or grain shipments. The Via Salaria was the prototype, but similar salt roads stretched across the empire. In the Po Valley of northern Italy, salt from the Adriatic coast moved inland to feed armies guarding the Alpine passes. In Gaul, Roman engineers improved local tracks to transport salt from coastal evaporation ponds to inland cities, like Lugdunum, modern Lyon. In Britain, the so-called saltways connected the Droitwich brine springs to military garrisons and civilian settlements. In many conquered regions, Roman governors imposed a vectigal, Soluses, salt tax. This was not just a way to raise revenue. It was a means of asserting imperial control. By regulating who could produce and sell salt, Rome kept local economies dependent on its authority. Roman military planning often incorporated salt into its logistics. Legions moving into hostile territory made sure to secure salt supplies before advancing. An army without salt could not preserve its rations, and salted food was far easier to transport than fresh provisions. Commanders also knew that controlling salt works in newly conquered lands could help win over or subdue local populations. One famous example comes from the Second Punic War. When Hannibal crossed the Alps into Italy, the Romans feared that the Carthaginian army would cut them off from coastal salt supplies. In response, Roman forces secured inland brine springs and fortified key points along the salt roads. Losing those routes would have left Rome's armies dangerously undersupplied. Salt even appears in Roman diplomacy and punishment. The phrase, "to sow the earth with salt," is often associated with the Roman destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, though historians debate whether it was literal or symbolic. Either way, the association of salt with ruin turning fertile land barren shows its deep cultural resonance. Beyond war, salt shaped the location and growth of settlements. Many Roman towns originated as way stations along salt roads. Places like Rete, modern Rieti in the Sabine Hills, flourished because they sat at the intersection of inland salt distribution routes. The predictable movement of merchants and caravans brought wealth, markets, and cultural exchange. Over time, the Salt trade became so embedded in Roman life that it was taken for granted. People who bought salted fish in a bustling market rarely thought about the roads, storage facilities, and political decisions that made it possible. Yet the network was there, quietly supporting the empire's vast population. And there is a curious twist. Salt did not just travel along roads. In certain parts of the empire, it moved along rivers, canals, and even specially designed barges. This hybrid transport system gave Rome flexibility in how it supplied its cities and garrisons. The question is, how did this white gold trade system hold together for centuries? And what happened to it when Rome's political unity began to fracture? That's where the story turns next. When the Western Roman Empire began to unravel in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the salt roads were among the many systems tested by political collapse. The roads themselves remain stone paving can endure for centuries, but the centralized network that made them so efficient started to fray. Without strong imperial oversight, the vectigal Salus Rome's salt tax became harder to enforce. Local warlords, tribal leaders, or breakaway governors often seized control of salt sources and distribution points. In some areas, the once unified trade fractured into small, guarded monopolies. Salt became scarcer, and its price rose, making it once again a true luxury in some inland regions. This scarcity had practical consequences. Urban populations that had depended on regular deliveries of salted food found themselves vulnerable to famine. Armies could no longer rely on consistent supplies from distant sources and were forced to forage or depend on local production. For a society used to the smooth flow of goods along the Via Salaria and its counterparts, this was more than an inconvenience, it was a shock to the system. And yet, in many places, the salt roads endured as living routes. In Italy, the Via Salaria still carried goods, no longer under the eye of a Roman governor, but under the watch of local rulers. Traders adapted by forming smaller caravans, often armed, and by negotiating passage through territories controlled by rival factions. Interestingly, the decline of imperial Rome did not erase the salt roads' influence. Many medieval trade networks in Europe, from the Hanseatic League's Baltic salt trade to the overland Salstrays routes in Germany, can be traced back to Roman pathways. The infrastructure Rome had built was simply too useful to abandon. In a symbolic way, salt outlived the empire itself. It became the economic lifeblood of many medieval towns, and disputes over salt production and taxation fueled wars, treaties, and revolutions for centuries after Rome's fall. The logic that had guided the Via Salaria, that a reliable road to a vital resource was worth any investment, remained valid. Today, the Via Salaria is still a functioning road in Italy, threading its way from Rome to the Adriatic coast. Modern drivers speeding along it may not think about the caravans of ox-drawn carts, the soldiers marching beside them, or the merchants tallying their loads of white gold. But the route they travel has carried salt for more than 2,000 years. The Roman salt roads are a reminder that the foundations of empires are often built on unglamorous necessities. Gold and silver may dazzle, but salt, grainy, common, and essential, has moved armies, built cities, and kept people alive through both feast and famine. And perhaps the quiet lesson is this: if you want to understand the true strength of a civilization, Look not only at its monuments and battles, but at its roads, and ask what those roads were built to carry. Before Julius Caesar became the man who restructured Rome's government, conquered Gaul, and met a dramatic end in the Senate, he undertook a quieter, stranger reform. He fixed the calendar, or at least he tried to. The Roman calendar before Caesar's reforms was a messy, politically manipulated system. Its origins lay in a lunar cycle, said to have been introduced by King Romulus and later modified by King Numa Pompilius. By the late Republic, the official year was supposed to have 355 days, divided into 12 months, with an extra month, Mercedonius, inserted occasionally to keep the seasons aligned with the months. The trouble was, occasionally depended on the whims of the pontifice's higher-ranking priests who controlled the calendar. They could insert or omit the extra month to favor political allies or inconvenience opponents. Extending or shortening a year could help a magistrate stay in office longer, delay elections, or adjust tax deadlines. This made the Roman year a tool of political gamesmanship rather than a stable measure of time. By the mid-1st century BCE, the Roman calendar was so out of sync with the solar year that festivals were drifting far from their seasonal markers. The harvest festival might occur weeks before the harvest, and spring rituals could fall in what felt like late winter. Farmers and generals alike found this increasingly impractical. When Caesar became Pontifex Maximus chief priest in 63 BCE, he inherited not only the title but the calendar problem. It wasn't until after his rise to sole power, however, that he had the authority to enforce a lasting solution. Around 46 BCE, he consulted with Greek and Egyptian astronomers, who suggested adopting a solar calendar like the one used in Alexandria. This calendar measured the year at roughly 365 and a quarter days, far more accurate than the old lunar-based system. To make the change, Caesar first had to realign the months with the season. This required an extraordinary year of confusion in 46 BCE, 445 days long, so that the new system could start fresh on January 1st, 45 BCE. From then on, the year would have 365 days, with an extra day added every 4 years, what we now call a leap year. This was the birth of the Julian calendar, a structure that would outlast the Roman Empire and, in modified form, is still in use today. But Caesar's reform was not without its critics. Some Romans resented the loss of old traditions tied to the lunar cycle, while others simply disliked the disruption of having festivals and market days shifted around. Still, the reform solved the immediate chaos. Farmers could once again plan planting and harvest by predictable dates. Magistrates could count their terms accurately, and religious festivals realigned with their proper seasons. Yet even Caesar's calendar was not perfect hand over the centuries. The small inaccuracies in his calculation would cause new problems, leading to another reform many centuries later. But before that happened, the Julian calendar would carry Rome through its imperial centuries, shaping how time itself was measured. In the next section, we'll see how Caesar's calendar reshaped Roman life not just in agriculture and politics, but in religion, empire building, and even the naming of our months. When Caesar's reform took effect in 45 BCE, it did more. then tidy up the months. It rewired how Romans thought about time itself. The new Julian calendar had months of fixed lengths, 31 or 30 days, with February holding the occasional extra leap year day. The old, erratic, intercalary month, Mercedonius, was gone, and with it the priestly privilege of bending time to political convenience. This removal of calendar manipulation was not just a technical fix, it was an assertion of centralized control. Time, once a tool in the hands of the pontifices, now followed an unchanging imperial rule. The names of the months also began to take on political significance. Quintilis, the month of Caesar's birth, was renamed Julius July in his honor. Later, under Augustus, Sextilis was renamed Augustus August. This was more than vanity, was a symbolic way of embedding political authority into the very fabric of daily life. Every time someone marked a date, they acknowledged imperial power. Religious observances had to adapt. Festivals, like Saturnalia, once held according to the shifting lunar calendar, now had fixed dates. The agricultural rites of Ceres, the wine festivals of Liber, and the games in honor of Jupiter were recalibrated. Farmers, priests, and magistrates had to adjust their rhythms to match the new solar-driven order. The military also benefited. Campaign seasons could now be planned more reliably, as commanders knew when spring and summer would arrive, according to the calendar rather than guesswork. Supply lines, tax collection, and provincial governance all gained stability from the regularized year. Yet not everyone embraced the reform easily. In rural areas, older lunar traditions lingered, and farmers continued to note the phases of the moon for planting and fishing. Some conservative senators grumbled that Caesar had meddled too much with sacred customs, but opposition was mute. Control was firm, and the benefits of a fixed year were quickly felt in trade, taxation, and administration. The spread of the Julian calendar throughout the Roman world was rapid. Provincial governors introduced it in Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa. In the eastern provinces, where Greek and Egyptian timekeeping systems already leaned toward solar calendars, the transition was smoother. But in some corners of the empire, like Judea, religious calendars remained distinct, coexisting uneasily with Rome's civil system. The Julian calendar was, in a sense, a quiet unifier of the empire. Soldiers from Syria to Britannia, merchants from Carthage to the Danube, and farmers in Sicily or Anatolia all counted their days in the same way. It was an invisible thread binding together lands that might otherwise have shared little beyond Roman rule. But Caesar's calculation of the year 365 days and 6 hours was not perfectly accurate. It was off by about 11 minutes per year. That error was tiny, almost imperceptible in a human lifetime, but over centuries it would accumulate. The date of the spring equinox would begin to drift. Festivals would lose their seasonal anchors once more, and eventually another great reform would be needed. The question, though, is how long the Julian calendar could hold before nature caught up, and who would take on the task of fixing time once again. The Julian calendar entered Roman life as a practical solution, but its real legacy lay in its endurance. Long after Caesar's death, his calendar became one of the most lasting elements of his rule, surviving the fall of the Republic, the rise and decline of the empire, and even the collapse of Roman authority in the West. Through the centuries, the system proved remarkably durable. For more than 1,600 years, much of Europe measured time according to Caesar's design. Even when new kingdoms rose from Rome's ruins, Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul, Anglo-Saxons in Britain, they kept the Julian year, partly because it was easier to preserve a functioning calendar than to invent a new one. But the small flaw in Caesar's calculation and extra 11 minutes per year slowly revealed itself. By the Middle Ages, the drift had become noticeable. The spring equinox, which had fallen on March 25th in Caesar's time, now arrived around March 11th for the Church, which used the equinox to calculate the date of Easter. This was more than a curiosity, was a growing problem. Still, inertia held. Adjusting a calendar is no small feat. People measured taxes, rents, religious feasts, and legal contracts by it. To alter the dates meant adjusting the entire machinery of society. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII finally acted. With advice from astronomers, he refined Caesar's leap year system, removing 3 leap days every 400 years to correct the drift. This became the Gregorian calendar, the one most of the world uses today. But even then, the Julian calendar did not disappear overnight. Protestant countries resisted the papal change for centuries, keeping Caesar's version in daily use. Russia, Greece, and other Orthodox nations clung to it well into the 20th century, and the Eastern Orthodox Church still uses it for liturgical purposes. In this way, Julius Caesar, man of armies, politics, and civil war, ended up shaping the lives of farmers, shopkeepers, and priests long after his empire vanished. His reform of time became his most widespread and enduring legacy. There is something almost ironic in this. Caesar's military conquests were reversed, his political arrangements undone, his monuments eroded or destroyed, but the way he counted the days survived, quietly governing human life for centuries. And so, when you glance at a calendar today, whether paper or digital, you are still, in some small way, living in Caesar's year. His solution to the drifting seasons became one of the rare pieces of Roman governance that truly stood the test of time, which raises a quiet question for us. In the long sweep of history, will the tools we build for daily life endure longer than the empires we build for glory? Long before Rome became an empire of marble forums and stone amphitheaters, it was a modest settlement on the banks of the Tiber River. In those early centuries, one of the most important commodities moving through the city was not gold, not silver, and not even granite, was salt. In the ancient world, salt was not simply a seasoning. It was a necessity for survival. Salt preserved meat and fish before refrigeration existed, allowing armies to march further and traders to travel longer. It was essential for human health, preventing dangerous deficiencies, and it played a role in religious rituals, symbolizing purity and permanence. Rome's strategic location gave it control over a splenta-producing area near the coast, the Salinae, at the mouth of the Tiber. These shallow coastal pans allowed seawater to evaporate, leaving behind valuable crystals. From here, salt could be brought up the Via Salaria, the salt road, into the city and beyond. This was one of Rome's earliest trade routes, linking it to inland communities that could supply cattle, grain, and other goods in exchange. As Rome expanded, salt's role shifted from trade to taxation. The Roman state recognized that everyone needed it, rich or poor, soldier or civilian, and so it became a reliable source of revenue. A vectigal, or state levy, was placed on the commodity because salt was bulky and difficult to smuggle in large quantities. It was a practical choice for taxation. Over time, the administration of the salt tax became more formalized. Officials called salinators oversaw production, collection, and distribution. Contracts for salt supply were auctioned to private publicanatax farmers who paid the state for the right to sell it at a profit. The system was lucrative, and revenues helped fund not just the upkeep of the roads and the harbor, but also public works that shaped the growing city. The salt tax was also one of the few levies Romans tolerated, with minimal rebellion. Unlike arbitrary land taxes or grain levies, the salt tax was predictable and applied broadly. Everyone paid, from the patrician to the plebeian, which gave it a certain rough sense of fairness in the Roman mind. Still, the state's control over salt was not without political implications. In times of unrest, Rome could restrict supply to rebellious regions. In war, salt could be sent to loyal allies and withheld from enemies. Control of salt was, in this sense, a quiet but effective tool of governance. By the late Republic, the revenues from salt alongside customs duties, mining profits, and provincial taxes were part of the economic backbone that supported Rome's expansion. But salt's story was far from over. It would move from being an ordinary necessity to a symbol of power, and in some cases, a weapon of war. In the next section, we'll see how Rome's control of salt influenced military campaigns, social order, and even the language we use today. By the height of the Republic, Rome had already realized that salt was more than a trade good. It was a lever of control. It could reward loyalty, sustain armies, and starve out resistance. Salt was critical to military logistics. A marching Roman legion needed food that could survive weeks or months in the field. Cured meats, salted fish, and brined vegetables traveled with soldiers from Britannia to Judea. Without salt, Rome's supply system would collapse. This necessity made the Via Salaria more than just an ancient road. It was a lifeline, carrying not only salt inland, but also carrying Rome's influence outward. The connection between salt and the army runs deep in Roman culture. Some historians believe the word salary comes from salarium, a payment that may have once been given, partly in salt, or as an allowance to buy it. While the exact origin is debated, the association between pay and salt reflects just how essential it was to Roman life. Salt also had ceremonial uses. Roman religious rites often included salt in sacrificial offerings, a symbol of purity and an element believed to seal a pact between mortals and the divine. New magistrates took oaths with salted cakes, mola salsa, and the Vestal virgins prepared them for public rituals. Thus, control of salt was not just economic. It touched the sacred heart of Roman identity. But salt's political value could be harsh. When a province rebelled, Rome might restrict its access to salt as punishment, crippling food preservation and trade. Salt could also be a weapon in war, not just by withholding it, but by destroying enemy supplies. The most famous, and perhaps partly legendary example, is the claim that after Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, it scattered salt over the ruins to ensure the land could not support life. Whether literal or symbolic, The gesture reinforced salt's association with conquest and finality. In civilian life, the salt tax vectigal solace was steady income for the state. Its uniform etopolet across different classes and regions made it less controversial than other taxes. But it was still a reminder that Rome's control reached into the most basic necessities. The tax collectors and salt contractors, the publicani, were sometimes resented, especially when they exploited shortages to raise prices. Despite these tensions, salt remained a quiet unifier of the empire. From the western provinces in Hispania to the markets of Antioch, people measured their daily needs in salt, just as Romans did. The same commodity salted fish in Alexandria and preserved olives in the hills of Latium. By the early empire, the salt supply had been woven into a vast economic web. State-run salt works operated in Italy, Gaul, and North Africa. Merchant ships carried it along the Mediterranean, and traders moved it up rivers deep into continental Europe. Salt had become, in its own quiet way, one of the foundations of Rome's stability. Yet this stability depended on the state's ability to maintain control. What would happen if that grip loosened or if access to salt was threatened? The answer lay in the next centuries. As Rome's fortunes shifted, as Rome entered its later centuries, the empire's control over its resources began to weaken. The salt supply, once a reliable instrument of power and unity, reflected these changes. During the 3rd century Crasissa, time of political instability, foreign invasions, and economic collapse, salt works in outlying provinces became harder to protect. Raids along the frontiers disrupted trade routes, and piracy in the Mediterranean threatened the safe passage of merchant vessels. In some regions, salt prices rose sharply, straining both civilian markets and the army's logistics. The Roman state responded with a mix of regulation and militarization. In certain areas, salt production was brought directly under the control of the military, ensuring that legions could secure their own supplies. In other cases, imperial authorities subsidized salt for urban populations to prevent unrest. This policy echoed the unknown, the grain dole, by which the government maintained food security in Rome itself. But salt's role as a strategic resource also made it a target. In conflicts with rival powers or rebellious provinces, salt works could be seized, destroyed, or blockaded. Losing control of a key salt-producing area could disrupt entire regions' food supply chains. In North Africa, for example, the loss of coastal salterns during the Vandal conquests in the 5th century had ripple effects across the Western Mediterranean. Even after the Western Empire fell in 476 CE, the structures of salt production and taxation endured under new rulers. The Ostrogoths, Byzantines, Lombards, and later the Papal states all continued to levy taxes on salt. In many cases, they simply adopted the Roman system wholesale, recognizing its efficiency and profitability. In fact, salt remained such a dependable source of revenue that it would reappear throughout European history as a major fiscal policy tool. Medieval rulers imposed gabelle taxes in France, malguyari in Spain, and various duties in Italy, often sparking local resistance. In this sense, the Roman salt tax foreshadowed future political tensions, sometimes even revolutions. Today, salt is inexpensive and abundant, but traces of its old significance remain in language and tradition. Words like salary and phrases such as worth one's salt echo Rome's practical and symbolic relationship with this mineral. The Via Salaria still runs through Italy, a reminder of one of the earliest roads that linked Rome's fortunes to a commodity so common we now take it for granted. Looking back, it's remarkable how something as ordinary as salt could have helped build, fund, and sustain one of the greatest empires in history. Rome's salt tax was not as dramatic as its battles or as grand as its architecture, but it was a steady, invisible force quietly preserving both food and power. And perhaps that is the real lesson, that the endurance of a civilization often rests not on the monuments it leaves behind, but on the everyday systems, like the flow of salt, that keep life moving, which makes one wonder, in the far future, will our descendants study our own hidden foundations with the same quiet astonishment? When most people imagine the achievements of ancient Mesopotamia, they think of towering ziggurats, sprawling irrigation canals, and the legendary city of Babylon. But the most enduring legacy of the land between the rivers is something far less visually impressive: small, rectangular pieces of baked or sun-dried clay. These were cuneiform tablets, the paperwork of the ancient world. They were not meant to dazzle. They were meant to keep track of things: goats, jars of beer, wages owed, land boundaries, temple inventories. And yet, these humble tablets were the first large-scale system of writing humanity ever used, emerging over 5,000 years ago. The origins of cuneiform were deeply practical. Around 3200 BCE, in the city-states of Sumer, temple administrators needed to manage the distribution of food and goods. The earliest records were simple pictograph-drawn symbols representing objects impressed into clay with a sharpened reed stylus. Over centuries, these drawings became more abstract and wedge-shaped, giving cuneiform its name, cuneus being the Latin word for wedge. Clay was an ideal medium for the geography of Mesopotamia. It was abundant along the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers easy to mold and durable once dried or baked. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay did not decay easily. Even accidental fires could preserve tablets for millennia, carbonizing them into hard, ceramic-like objects. A tablet could be small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, or large enough to require both hands to carry. Many had a flat writing surface, but for more important or sensitive information, scribes might create an envelope of clay around the tablet, sealing it with a stamped mark. Breaking open the envelope destroyed the seal, making tampering obvious an early form of document security. The role of the scribe in this world was both technical and prestigious. Learning cuneiform took years of training in schools where students practiced signs over and over until they could record transactions without error. Scribes were not just copyists. They were the accountants, notaries, and archivists of their time. Their work underpinned the functioning of palaces, temples, and merchant houses. Cuneiform tablets were not all business, however. While many dealt with trade or taxation, others contained hymns, proverbs, medical texts, astronomical observations, and even epic poetry, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. In this way, a technology invented for counting sheep became a medium for exploring the human condition. But in the earliest centuries, the majority of tablets were records of the mundane: a shipment of barley, the daily rations for a temple worker, the number of oxen grazing in a certain field, each transaction pressed into clay with steady hands. These details may seem trivial now, but together they reveal how an early civilization organized itself, survived, and planned for the future. The survival of these tablets is one of archaeology's great fortunes. While palaces crumbled and ziggurats eroded, the fired clay remained, storing the bureaucratic heartbeat of Mesopotamian life. And, as we will see in the next section, these simple records would evolve into a complex system of law, literature, and science, laying the groundwork for much of recorded history. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, cuneiform had developed far beyond its early role as an accounting tool. The wedge-shaped script could now represent not only numbers and goods, but also sounds, syllables, and entire ideas. This flexibility allowed it to capture far more than inventorious. It could now record the complexities of law, diplomacy, and literature. These were not abstract philosophical musings on justice. They were practical guidelines for everyday disputes. The most famous of these is the Code of Hammurabi, issued around 1754 BCE by the king of Babylon. Carved into a basalt stele and also copied onto clay tablets, it covered matters ranging from trade contracts to marriage arrangements to punishments for theft. The code's existence shows how writing allowed a ruler's will to extend far beyond their physical presence. A king could stand before his people and proclaim his rules, but once written, those rules could travel, carried to distant towns, preserved for generations, and referred to in times of uncertainty. But Mesopotamian tablets did not just record laws, they also contained treaties between states, letters between kings, and decrees about the movement of goods and labor. The so-called Amarna letters, found in Egypt but written in Akkadian cuneiform, reveal an international world where rulers exchanged both diplomatic courtesies and pointed demands. Temples, which had been the earliest centers of record-keeping, became archives of astonishing scale. A major temple complex could contain thousands of tablets, stored on shelves in clay jars, each labeled with a summary of its contents. Some were checked out to officials when needed, much like a library book today. In this environment, the scribe's role grew more central to governance. An elite scribe might serve directly under a king or high priest, drafting official proclamations, maintaining state archives, and overseeing lesser clerks. The training to reach such a position was rigorous, requiring mastery not only of writing but also of mathematics, accounting, and sometimes multiple languages. Meanwhile, the clay tablets themselves became more standardized. A merchant's account might have a predictable format, date, names of parties involved, list of goods, and witnesses. This standardization made records easier to verify and reduce disputes. In fact, many tablets have signatures either written or stamped with a cylinder seal adding another layer of authenticity. And yet, for all its sophistication, cuneiform writing remained physically tied to the realities of clay and reeds. Unlike later scripts on lighter materials, a tablet had weight. It occupied space. Transporting large numbers of them required carts or boats. Archives could be cumbersome, but they were also resilient. A fire that destroyed a wooden building might, paradoxically, preserve the entire collection of tablets within. By the end of the 2nd millennium BCE, cuneiform had become the shared written language of much of the Near East, from the Hittite capital of Hattusa to the royal libraries of Assyria. The script traveled with traders, diplomats, and conquerors. It was the informational infrastructure of an interconnected world, one where the most powerful weapon in politics could be a carefully worded text, impressed in wet clay. But the reach of cuneiform would also mean its decline. In the next section, we will see how this script born from Sumerian accounting spread across empires, transformed cultures, and eventually gave way to other forms of writing, leaving behind millions of silent tablets as its final archive. By the first millennium BCE, cuneiform was still the official script of great powers like Assyria and Babylonia, but it was no longer alone. The alphabets, simpler to learn, quicker to write, had emerged from the Levant and was spreading rapidly across the Mediterranean world, where cuneiform required mastery of hundreds of symbols. The alphabet used just a couple dozen. For centuries, the two systems coexisted, but the efficiency of alphabetic writing proved irresistible to traders, administrators, and eventually even states. Aramaic, written alphabetically, became the lingua franca of the Near East under the Persian Empire. Yet, cuneiform persisted in certain spheres, particularly in scholarly and religious contexts. Temples and royal courts still maintained archives in the old script, partly out of tradition, partly because so much accumulated knowledge was locked within it. Astronomical records, medical treatises, and ancient epics were copied and recopied, ensuring continuity even as the wider world shifted to new scripts. This deliberate preservation effort is most famously seen in the library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, in the 7th century BCE. His vast collection at Nineveh contained tens of thousands of tablets, works on history, religion, mathematics, and literature, including the most complete surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Ashurbanipal boasted that he could read cuneiform himself, a skill rare even among kings by his time. But after the fall of the Assyrian and later Babylonian empires, the use of cuneiform dwindled. By the 1st century CE, it had largely disappeared from everyday life. The last known cuneiform tablet dates to 75 CE from a small astronomical text. In Urukhan, almost 3,000-year span from the script's birth to its final breath. And then, for nearly 2 millennia, the wedges fell silent. Without living scribes to teach the signs, cuneiform became unreadable. To later civilizations, these clay tablets were mysterious relics, objects with patterns but no apparent meaning. Some were even mistaken for decorative bricks. It was only in the 19th century that scholars, working painstakingly from multilingual inscriptions like the Behistun inscription in Persia, cracked the code. The process mirrored the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs with the Rosetta Stone, but it was arguably more difficult. Once understood, cuneiform revealed a vast hidden record of humanity's earliest cities, laws, and stories. Today, museums around the world hold hundreds of thousands of these tablets, and many more remain buried in the ground. Each one, whether a royal decree or a mundane grain, tallies a small voice from a civilization that shaped the course of history. It's easy to focus on the drama of kings and battles. But cuneiform reminds us that the story of humanity is also written in quiet lists and careful records. The Mesopotamians did not just build cities, they built systems for remembering, and perhaps the most humbling thought is this: 5,000 years from now, what traces of our own information systems will survive? Will our data be as puzzling as the wedges of clay left by the scribes of Sumer? When you hear the name Nabatean, you probably think of Petra, the rock-cut city in modern-day Jordan, its rose-red facades glowing in the desert light. But the true genius of the Nabateans was not their architecture. It was their ability to control water in one of the driest regions on earth. Unlike the Nile-fed Egyptians or the canal builders of Mesopotamia, the Nabateans had no great river to depend on. They lived in the rugged deserts of the Levant, where rainfall was scarce and unpredictable. The nearest reliable water sources were often miles away, and a single failed season could mean disaster. The survival of their people and the flourishing of their trade network depended entirely on their skill in collecting, storing, and moving water. And so, they became masters of desert hydrology. The Nabateans built an intricate system of aqueducts, channels, reservoirs, and cisterns. Many of these were carved directly into the rock, invisible to casual eyes. This secrecy was deliberate. In a landscape where water was as valuable as gold, controlling its flow meant controlling life itself. Seasonal flash floods were one of their key resources. In the desert, rain often comes all at once, violent downpours that send torrents rushing through Wadi's dry riverbeds. The Nabateans learned to intercept these floods with diversion channels and settling basins, capturing water before it could disappear into the sand. From there, they guided it into underground cisterns, where it was protected from evaporation. Some cisterns were monumental in scale, holding tens of thousands of liters. Others were small and scattered, ensuring travelers on the caravan routes always had access to water. The engineering was precise. Channels were cut at just the right gradient to prevent erosion, but still keep water moving. Stone linings reduced seepage. Even the placement of catchment areas took wind patterns into account, ensuring that the rare desert rains were trapped, not lost. And they didn't just store water, they rationed it. Large reservoirs often had stone staircases descending into their depths, so that as the water level dropped, users could still reach it without wasting any. At key points, the flow was regulated by gates or plugs, controlling distribution to fields, gardens, or animals. It's telling that the Nabatean capital of Petra could support a population far larger than its local rainfall would normally allow. Without their water management, it would have been a seasonal camp at best. Instead, it became a bustling hub for trade between Arabia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Yet the beauty of their system lay in its quiet invisibility. Unlike the monumental aqueducts of Rome, Nabatean waterworks were often hidden within the rock or buried beneath the sand, both to protect them from enemies and to guard their secrets. In the next section, we'll follow the water beyond Petra, tracing how the Nabateans extended their hydraulic network across hundreds of miles of desert to keep caravans moving and cities thriving. While Petra was the jewel of the Nabatean kingdom, it was not the only place their hydraulic genius was on display. The Nabateans controlled a trade network that stretched from the incense-producing lands of southern Arabia to the ports of the Mediterranean. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, and textiles traveled along these routes, and every caravan, sometimes Hundreds of camels strung depended on a chain of water sources that the Nabateans built and maintained. Desert trade was not just about knowing the paths, it was about knowing where to drink. The Nabateans mapped their empire in terms of reliable water stops. In some cases, these were natural springs, but more often, they were human-made cisterns, tucked into hillsides or carved into the floors of wadis. Unlike the open wells of other cultures, Nabatean water points were often sealed. A cistern might be covered with a fitted stone lid, its access hole just large enough for a bucket or jug. This kept out sand, animals, and crucially, invited strangers. The Nabateans did not leave water where anyone could take it. Control over these points was part of their geopolitical strength. Some caravan stops featured entire complexes of water infrastructure, multiple cisterns, small settling basins, and even rudimentary aqueducts, channeling water from seasonal streams. Archaeologists have found evidence of plaster-lined channels, miles away from any settlement, built solely to catch water for travelers. The timing of caravans often depended on these systems. Long-distance journeys were scheduled to coincide with the filling of certain reservoirs after seasonal rains. Skilled guides, often from Nabatean families, knew exactly when each cistern would be at its fullest, and how much could be drawn without endangering the return trip. And yet the system was not static. As the Nabatean kingdom expanded, new cisterns were added, and old ones were maintained or enlarged. Workers could reshape rock to channel flash floods more efficiently, or line reservoirs with new materials to prevent leaks. This adaptability allowed their trade network to survive drought years that would have crippled less prepared peoples. The political implications were enormous. By controlling water across such vast distances, the Nabateans could dictate the movement of goods. Caravans that wanted safe passage needed Nabatean permission, not just for protection from raiders, but for access to the lifeline of the desert. We often think of ancient power in terms of armies and fortresses. But in the Nabatean world, power could be measured in leaders. A king who could fill a caravan's skins and jars held more influence than one who could brandish a sword. In the next section, we'll see how Roman expansion into the region both threatened and adopted the Nabateans' water mastery, and how their aqueducts, though quieter than their monuments, became one of the most enduring legacies of their civilization. By the early 2nd century CE, the Nabatean kingdom had reached the height of its wealth, but its independence was waning. The Roman Empire, expanding relentlessly into Arabia and the Levant, saw the Nabatean trade network as both a prize and a threat. In 106 CE, the Romans annexed the kingdom, incorporating it into the province of Arabia Petraea. Unlike some conquests, this was relatively bloodless. The Nabatean elite were integrated into Roman administration, and their cities, especially Petra, continued to thrive for a time. The Romans were no strangers to grand waterworks, but the desert was new territory for their engineers. Here, they found that the Nabatean systems, small-scale, hidden, and adapted to local geography, were far more effective than the monumental aqueducts Rome was famous for. Rather than replacing the Nabatean methods, Roman authorities often maintained and even expanded them. They repaired cisterns, reinforced channels, and sometimes added new features, blending Roman masonry with Nabatean rock-cut systems. In places like Avdat in modern Israel, archaeologists can trace centuries of continuous use of Nabatean reservoirs, first by their builders, then by Roman settlers, and later by Byzantine communities. Yet the trade routes that had sustained the Nabateans began to shift. With Roman control came new roads, ports, and shipping lanes that bypassed the old overland caravan trails. As maritime trade grew, the need for long desert crossings diminished. The once crucial chain of cisterns and aqueducts slowly fell out of use. By the 4th century CE, Petra's population had declined dramatically. Earthquakes damaged some of its water infrastructure, and without the intense maintenance it had once received, the system began to break down. Flash floods that had once been carefully captured now carved new paths, filling cisterns with silt instead of water. And yet, the legacy of the Nabatean engineers did not vanish. Many of their techniques were quietly absorbed into the practices of desert farmers and herders. In remote corners of the Negev and southern Jordan, villagers still use cisterns and channels that follow Nabatean designs. Some modern water harvesting projects in arid regions even take direct inspiration from their methods. Today, the Great Fatra attract millions of tourists, but few notice the narrow channels carved alongside the pathways, or the half-buried stone openings leading to ancient cisterns. These humble works, not the ornate tombs, were what made life in the desert possible. In the end, the Nabateans' true monument was not a temple or a treasury, it was a network of water hidden in the rock, invisible until you knew where to look. And perhaps the greatest irony is that in a world obsessed with spectacle, their most valuable achievement remains something that was designed to be seen by as few people as possible.